Yeah, including at the back? Okay, great. My name's Nick Zayer. I am a professor here at Cambridge, and I'm also the Access and Outreach Officer for Cambridge University. This is Dan Jolowitz, my counterpart from Oxford. It's very exciting to see you all here today. I hope you had a relatively easy journey here. We're going to spend a bit of time telling you about the sort of shape of our courses in Oxford and Cambridge, and about the kinds of things we do and the kinds of things that our students go on to do after they've done classics here. Before I do that, I have to start with some standard information before we get going about fire safety. So please, can you make sure to keep any bags out of the aisles? As far as we know, there is no fire alarm test booked for today. So if you hear a fire alarm, it is the real thing. So in that case, there are fire exits on either side of the stage, here and here, as well as behind you. So those go to the lower lobby, those go to the upper lobby, and in either case, you leave out the front of the building. The assembly area is next to Little Hall, which is the next building along, but the student helpers out there know where to take you in the event of an emergency, so please just follow them. And that's all I have to say about fire. So, Oxford and Cambridge. I'm going to start off, and I'll give a bit of an introduction, and then talk about Cambridge Classics and the Cambridge Classics degree. Then Dan will take over to do the Oxford side, then we'll swap again back and forth to do admissions and so forth, and there'll be time for questions at the end. If this thing works, I will start off. Good. So the shape of this is going to be why classics, course structure, how the teaching and learning works, how you go about applying, and benefits. Well, why do classics? Hopefully, if you're here, you already have some interest in classics, but classics kind of covers everything. Anything to do with the ancient world, sort of focused around the Mediterranean and the Roman and Greek worlds. As you probably know, huge amounts of literature produced by these cultures. We study that. We've got tons and tons of history to look at. We have got philosophy, ancient philosophy, and possibly some modern philosophy as well. Is that still a thing at Oxford? Yes, good, okay. We also look at linguistics, how languages work and how they change over time. That's my speciality. We have archaeology, including travel to sites of one sort or another. So here in Cambridge, over the summer, we have, at least at the moment, 2 ongoing archaeological digs that people can go off to. We also run trips to things like the British Museum and so forth, art and architecture alongside archaeology. And in general, the idea of how come nowadays classics is still important? How does it still shape, for good or ill, the way we think, the way we write, and how translations of ancient texts have become extremely important for thinking about the ancient world. So we tend to think of classics as, in Cambridge, as breaking down into 5 areas, although the 5 areas sort of interweave with each other. And so those are Greek and Latin literature, philosophy, ancient history, art and archaeology, linguistics, and then interdisciplinary options and reception, this idea of the modern world relative to the ancient world. So how do we organise that in Cambridge? I'm not going to go into the little details of this, but the key thing to know in terms of subjects is you can be interested in all of those things that I've mentioned and do all of them, or you can choose 1 or 2 particular areas of interest at some point and move on with them. Whether you do that over 4 years or over 3 years depends on whether you are already doing Latin A-level or equivalent. or already have Latin A-level or equivalent. If you only have Greek A-level or equivalent, which is a fairly unusual state of affairs, then we sort of deal with that on an ad hoc basis. But for those who have got Latin A-level, you come in and you do a 3-year degree. For those who do not have Latin A-level, you come in and do a 4-year degree, and as this slide helpfully shows. So, those 4 years are called prelims, Part 1A, Part 1B, and Part 2. Prelims is the extra year at the beginning that you do if you're a 4-year candidate. And one of the key things you do in that extra year at the beginning is learn Latin. So we spend a lot of time teaching you Latin and working with you to get your Latin up to the level where you can start engaging with genuine ancient texts, ancient literature, and we like to do that as fast as possible because we think that's the most rewarding thing to be dealing with, real texts. Once you get into the second term of prelims, we already start introducing Greek language to you, and from that point on, Greek and Latin run in parallel together for the rest of the course. But you're not in a sort of walled garden, learning all this Latin, getting your head down. You will also do, there are sort of what we would think of as taster supervisions, so taster small group teaching in things like philosophy, history, art and archaeology, and linguistics as well. And at the end of that year, you'll be examined on Latin and a couple of set texts that you do over the course of that year, and a little bit of Greek, and also on these other subjects. You will end up answering one question for each subject, 2 questions in total at the end of the year in exams. Then we come to Part 1A. So this is where about 50% of the people come in who have done Latin A-level. We're running at about 50% with and without at the moment. And in some ways, this is quite similar. We've got target texts, set texts in both languages, Latin and Greek. Carry on being getting teaching in Latin and Greek. This is going to be true also if you've come in with Latin A-level and in theory with Greek A-level, although not that many people come in with Greek A-level. And again, you'll either try out all of these other options or you will continue them. If you've already been here for a year, you can choose whether to carry on with the 2 you've already chosen to answer questions in at the end of your exam and do them in more depth, or to spread out a bit and do the other 2, or some combination of those. By the time we get to Part 1B, so the second year if you've come in with Latin A-level, the third if you've come in without, essentially what we have is we carry on working on language, and we have a large array of mini modules, so small modules. They don't involve many hours of lectures and supervisions, and they're essentially on an array of options of themes from the literatures, philosophy, history, art and archaeology, and linguistics, right? Choose any that you want, right? We are committed to classics being extremely broad, and we trust you to choose whatever options you want to choose. By the time we get to Part 2, the final year for everyone, at this point, across the sort of 2 streams, people are able, if they want to engage with literature and other kinds of texts in Latin and Greek off their own bat. At this point, the formal language teaching stops on the whole. But again, we have 4 modules across the year, so these are bigger modules than the mini ones you did in Part 1B on an array of topics across our usual literature, philosophy, linguistics, art and archaeology, history, and so forth. You can also borrow a course from another degree. So, for example, you can do Babylonian language taken from the archaeology degree. You can do the tragedy paper taken from the English degree. Those kinds of things. And something that a lot of people do is write a dissertation. They don't have to do that, but the majority of people do choose to do that, of about 10,000 words on a topic that they choose. So they get together with a supervisor, agree a topic, agree a question, and work on that over the course of the year. And here are some ideas of present and recent options within those Part 2 papers. So again, you take 4 of these from some of these kinds of options, ranging from sort of what one might think of as sort of traditional literary work, Virgil's Aeneid or Homer's Odyssey, across a vast range of other possibilities across all 5 of our areas that classics does. It's also possible to do classics and modern languages. Strictly speaking, that degree is just in modern languages. So there is no classics in the degree title, but one of the modern languages you can do as part of that is either Latin or Greek. But in those cases, you usually would do that if you already have an A-level or equivalent in those languages. You're not able to take those from scratch, I believe. And if you want to know more about those, you can look at the Modern Languages website. And this is the point where we swap over and Dan tells you about Oxford. Here's the clicker.
Well, thanks, Nick. What happens over at Oxford is a very good question. There are lots of similarities, obviously, with some of the things that Nick's just said about what happens in Cambridge, but there are some very important differences too. And the 2 that I would highlight are there are more options in terms of the number of classics courses that you can apply for, and there are 6 of those, and I'll go into a little bit of detail about some of them. And the second key difference is course length. And again, I shall try and enumerate how some of these things are a bit different. Okay, so here are the 6 courses that are available at Oxford. The headline here is that you can apply to any of these without any knowledge of Latin and Greek. You don't need to know any of the ancient languages to apply for these courses. We will get you up and running in either or both of Latin and Greek, so you don't need to worry about that. Literae Humaniores, is the sort of formal name for our largest classics course with an intake of around 100 people a year, means the more human letters. I think this was a name introduced in the early 19th century because people tended to do the res divinae, which was sort of more theological things. Anyway, that's the explanation for why it's got this rather arcane name, Literae Humaniores, more tenderly known as Lit Hum. But again, this is a very literary course. With a literary focus, you'll read lots of text. The focus here is on being able to read texts, analyze texts, think about texts in Greek and maybe Latin as well by the end of the course. That's not to say it's not a multidisciplinary course. It embraces art and archaeology, ancient philosophy, modern philosophy, history, as well as philology and linguistics. But again, I can go into more detail about some of these things in a subsequent slide. Classical archaeology and ancient history, again, operates under the acronym of CAAH, C-A-A-H. So if you hear people talking about CAAH, that's what they're talking about, classical archaeology and ancient history. The focus in this degree is on the visual and material, archaeological and historical subject. So it's less of a literary degree. So if your passion at the moment happens to be on the visual material archaeological side, then this might be a degree that you'll think about. It's got a stronger focus on ancient history and archaeology than it does on literary texts. Then on the right-hand side, we've got a number of joint schools. And what we mean by this are joint courses taught with other faculties. So, for example, you'd be able to study classics and a modern language, or classics with English literature, classics with Asian and Middle Eastern studies. Those are the more literary ones on the top there, and then the bottom one there is a joint school, ancient and modern history. Again, the focus here is on the historical material rather than it being a literary course. So to go into a little more detail about Literae Humaniores. Again, this is our largest course. You don't need to apply with Latin or Greek. You do not need the ancient language. This is going to be a headline of everything that I say. You can learn Latin or Greek from scratch when you come up. It's divided into two parts. The first 5 terms, I should say it's a 4-year course. I mean, that's an important factor in thinking about its structure. In the first 5 terms, you'll do what's called mods, or honor moderations. Now, if you're coming without Latin or Greek, in those first 5 terms, you can choose one of those ancient languages to study, and we'll get you up to speed in either Latin or Greek, whichever one you choose. It might be that you're coming already with, for example, Latin, but don't have Greek, and that means we'll get you up to speed in Greek. Or it might be the other way around, that you come with Greek and we'll get you up to speed in Latin. So by the end of those 5 terms, you'll at least have one ancient language by the end of those 5 terms. It's a fantastic course, not least because it embraces everything you can think about in terms of the classical. You'll do ancient literature, authors ranging from Euripides to Homer to Aristophanes to Catullus to Plautus to Lucian. A fantastic range of ancient literature. You'll also choose a philosophy subject, so you'll have a chance to get some philosophical experience. You'll also do a history or art and archaeological paper, or a linguistics paper. So it really allows you to get a taste of the ancient world in its entirety. So those are the first 5 terms. Then for the next 7 terms, you'll do what's called Greats. And this involves taking 8 papers from a fantastic range of, I think it's around 80 options. And again, you'll be hard-pressed to think about any topic from the ancient world that you wouldn't be able to take a paper on, although I'm sure someone will be able to think of something and slip me up. But in any case, there are 80 papers to choose from. There are a certain number of restrictions, but this basically allows you to compose your own portfolio of 8 papers. There is a fantastic range of opportunities here for you to do what interests you. You'll have the option, for example, of doing a thesis, dissertation, if you'd like, or if you're really keen, and in addition to your 8th paper, you could also do an additional thesis. So you could take that as a 9th paper if you thought, well, I must do 8 papers, but I also really want to, write a thesis on Prudentius or something like that. There is the availability for you to do that. Okay, I think that's and again, very, very happy to answer questions more about Literae Humaniores. Moving on to some of our joint schools, classics and modern languages. Basically, the keynote here is that this course allows you to combine study of Latin and Greek, or Latin or Greek, with a modern language, amongst which you can choose from, for example, Czech with Slovak, French, German, Portuguese, modern Greek, Spanish, Russian. So you really, again, there is a wonderfully broad portfolio of languages that you could choose to study in addition to Latin or Greek. You do not need Latin or Greek before coming to apply for this. You can apply without the ancient languages. You do, however, need to come with the modern language that you choose. So that's an important criterion when thinking about classics and modern languages. Depending on whether you're coming with Latin or Greek, and depending on which particular pathway you choose, this is either a 4 or 5 year course. If you are interested in this course, please do look at the website, because there are various pathways for doing this course. For example, there's one pathway where you would do mods, essentially. So you would essentially do the first 5 terms as if it were a Literae Humaniores course, and then you would go on to do more modern language material for finals. Or you could do what's called the preliminary course, where there is a more evenly balanced mixture of classics and modern languages in your first year. But again, please do check the website for the nitty-gritty details of that. The other thing I should say about classics and modern language is that there's the opportunity for a year abroad, where you might go and be a teaching assistant or have an internship of some form. And again, so the classics and modern languages allows for that year abroad to get up to speed on a modern language. Classics and English. Again, this is a course with a very heavy literary focus. It's either a 3 or 4 year course, depending on whether you're coming with an ancient language or not. So again, you don't need to have Latin or Greek to apply for this course. We will get you up to speed. And depending on whether you're coming with an ancient language, it's either a 3 or a 4 year course. It's an excellent course because, again, if you're interested in both classical literature and English literature, this is the course that allows you to continue deepening your knowledge of these subjects. There's the possibility of exploring literature across ages and across cultural boundaries. So, for example, you might do a paper that looks at epic from the ancient world up until English Renaissance literature, and more recently than that. There are papers that allow you to think about how tragedy or comedy or epic have developed across time. So again, this is a wonderfully literary paper that allows you to maintain your passions in both the classical world and in English literature, if such exist. Classics with Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. This, again, is a course that allows you to combine a passion and enthusiasm for classics, maybe with a burgeoning interest in a language that might be less familiar. So some of the languages that you could learn on the Asian and Middle Eastern side include course, again, you don't need any knowledge of these languages, either Greek or Latin, or the Asian and Middle Eastern side. You can apply without any knowledge of these. It's a literary focused course, so there will be an option for doing some history and perhaps philosophy, but again, this is more of a literary course. So these are the two courses that I mentioned that have more of a historical and art and archaeological focus. So the first is classical archaeology and ancient history, and the second is ancient and modern history. These are the two main non-language-based degrees. These are very much an archaeological and historical focus. Both are 3-year courses, but both do contain the possibility of learning Latin or Greek if you want to explore that possibility, but you don't have to. It's certainly not compulsory. In terms of CAR, Classical Archaeology and Ancient History, I'd say that there are two key things that CAR offers that are reasonably unique to such courses in the UK. The first is that you will receive integrated classes where both historians and archaeologists teach together in the same teaching setting. So you get a fantastic perspective from both historians and archaeologists in the same room. The second is that there are these wonderful opportunities for field work and museum work, and indeed part of these courses involves writing a dissertation or a thesis on the basis of work that you would have done on an archaeological site or on an object from a museum, for example. And I know that current possibilities for archaeological work include, I think, Hadrian's Villa at Tivoli in Italy, Halysa in northern Sicily, and I think places like Koumaza in northern Crete, or you might choose to work in the Ashmolean Museum, for example, if you didn't fancy having to do some travelling. So there are these wonderful opportunities for both field work and museum work here. Thinking about ancient and modern history, which is this is a joint degree that we do with history. This has a historical focus. Again, this is a degree that allows for a wonderfully broad historical scope. It's for people who are interested in history, well, sort of history with a capital H, the large idea of history. If you're interested in comparative global history, or how concepts like democracy, imperialism, colonialism are different across times and cultures, this is a fantastic degree that you might be interested in. You'll learn a lot about different historical methodologies, how people think about history, about how people go about analysing history, well, here are some examples of the types of geographical areas that you might consider: Greek, Roman, European, British, and there are also further options beyond those too. Oh.
Back to me. So we've talked about course shape at some length. What is the experience of doing these courses going to be like? Well, one of the best ways of answering that is to ask our wonderful student helpers, who can give you the kind of insight, so to speak. But in terms of the sort of structure of teaching, Cambridge and Oxford are rather different from most other universities. And there's a sort of key divide, in a sense, when we're thinking about types of teaching, between the kind of teaching that is offered by the faculty, so the sort of the university, as it were, and the type of teaching that is offered by colleges, the place where students mostly live and play sports and have their food in halls and so on and so forth. And that divide goes with a difference in the type of teaching that these bodies offer. So what one might think of as sort of traditional university teaching, which is to say lectures, rather like today, the students are sitting looking up at a lecturer who is telling them about something. They may be somewhat interactive, but on the whole, they are largish group teaching, and there's one person imparting knowledge or information or ideas to a biggish group. In Oxford and Cambridge, we also have things that are called supervisions in Cambridge and tutorials in Oxford, but they are basically the same thing. And mostly, those are organised by the individual college that a student is at. And those are very small group classes, right? So the general model, Dan, interrupt me at any point if I'm starting to say things that aren't accurate for Oxford, but the general model is that people will be, on the one hand, writing one or more essays more or less every week, or some other kind of equivalent piece of written work. And they're probably doing language work as well. So producing translations of Latin or Greek into English, or producing, in some cases, translations of English into Greek or Latin. And generally speaking, you have a supervision or a tutorial for each of these pieces of work every week, where you discuss the work with a supervisor/tutor, and maybe one or two other students. Right? It's relatively rare, I would say, to have a supervision or a tutorial at a size bigger than 3 students. Right? So this is quite a different method of teaching. You will have submitted work, often in advance, and you will, in your small group, discuss that work, especially when that work is something like an essay. The job of the supervisor or the tutor is to sort of facilitate a conversation, right, about a subject which usually you have gone from knowing sort of fairly little about to really quite a lot about in the course of about a week, and I'll come back to that. Okay, so those are the sort of 2 main types of teaching. There are, of course, also language classes, bigger teaching groups, which, again, are usually organised by the faculty, so that'll involve all the students doing the course, one sort of another. There's also this sort of in-between category of seminars, which is essentially kind of something halfway between a supervision tutorial and a lecture, small-ish group work. We've already mentioned these theses, dissertations that you can do. You choose to do independent learning in that sense. Right? You've chosen the question, you're going to go off and research it and write about it with the help of a supervisor or a tutor. But also, kind of everything you are doing, the basis of the work you are doing, in a sense, is independent learning, right? You will get given a question or a set of questions to choose from on a regular basis, and some help, reading lists, telling you what direction to look in, that kind of thing. But it is your job to sort of educate yourself, especially for supervisions. It's not just that we are trying to pour knowledge into your brains, right? And that's a very characteristic part of Oxford or Cambridge, this rhythm of producing written work that you will discuss with a small group of people, and which you will not be marked on, right? You will get feedback, either oral or written or both, but almost nothing that you write for any of these supervisions tutorials will count towards your final mark. So essentially you get huge amounts of practice at thinking, reading, learning for yourself, and writing a piece of work which is explanatory and argumentative. We've already mentioned things like field work, most obviously for art and archaeology, but not necessarily, and various kinds of practical training as well. Very happy to answer any questions on this topic of teaching, because Oxford and Cambridge are so different from other places later on. But now I'll move on to how do you go about applying to Cambridge and Oxford. Well, in a lot of ways, the answer is the same as you do for any other university. You fill in a UCAS form, which you submit along with some written work. Different colleges, at least in Cambridge, may ask for different amounts of written work. Is there a consistent amount in Oxford? Okay, well, you have the next slide anyway, so you can talk about it then. With us, it's normally somewhere between 1 and 2 pieces of written work. And that's work that you have done at school. We're not asking you to do extra work for this. The only difference really in terms of applying via the UCAS form is firstly that you have to apply somewhat earlier. So I think the deadline is usually around mid-October, whereas for other universities it's later. Secondly, you will get a little box at the bottom if you want us to know anything additional to what you've said to any other university. So there's a special Oxford or Cambridge little box. And thirdly, you can only apply to either Oxford or Cambridge, right? You can't hedge your bets and apply to both. If you get invited to interview, then you will come to Cambridge in the case of some colleges, or you will be interviewed online. Okay, this differs on a college-by-college basis. If you live outside the UK, most colleges will interview you online. So it's only if you live inside the UK, generally, that you would come to Cambridge. Otherwise, you would be interviewed online. And as I say, different colleges choose whether to do that in person or online. And you will get one or more usually two interviews organised by the college that you have chosen to apply to. If you choose to apply to a college, you can also make an open application, in which case you will be assigned to a college. You'll usually have one or two interviews there. If you already have Latin A-level or equivalent, then there will be a Latin language assessment, which may be baked into one of those interviews, in which case the interview will usually run a bit longer, or you may do it separately. But in any case, it will be done in an interview-style format. You will be given a piece of Latin, and you won't be asked to translate it on the spot, but you'll be given a bit of time to read it and then ask some questions about specific aspects of the text. If you are applying for the four-year course, you don't have Latin or Greek, then you will have a separate language aptitude assessment, which again is in an interview format, but a kind of structured interview, working through some questions that you'll be given by your interviewer that aim to test, as the name suggests, your aptitude for learning a language, or indeed two languages, from scratch. Generally speaking, again, this is technically up to colleges, but the typical offer is A star, 2 A's at A-level, or equivalents for advanced hires at IB that you can see here. Generally speaking, if you come up for an interview in Cambridge, the college will aim to do everything in one day. So you come up and go home within the one day. If you come from too far away for that to be possible, then colleges will accommodate you and you may stay for a night. But generally speaking, those are aimed to be a one-day experience. And now, over to Oxford.
Again, much of what Nick has said as regards Cambridge also applies to Oxford as well. I mean, one of the, I guess, key differences I'd note between Oxford and Cambridge is that Oxford offers are for 3 A's rather than for A star, AA. I don't know why that is. There might be a historical reason, I'm not sure. But in any case, our offers tend to be for 3 A's. A key thing to think about for applications going forward is that we no longer have admissions tests, so you don't need to worry about doing an admissions test language in advance. Any admissions test will take place language tests will take place within the interview process. But I can talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But in any case, as with Cambridge, our UCAS deadline, well, it might be the same as Cambridge, but the UCAS deadline is the 15th of October, I think 6 p.m, in case people want that level of detail. So you would do that as normal. In terms of written work, for most of the courses for Oxford, I think almost for all of the 6 that I've talked about, maybe at least 5 of them, you would need to submit 2 pieces of written work. One of the frequent questions that we get is, well, what sort of written work do we like? I guess an answer is work that shows you at your best, that shows your powers of expression, powers of analysis at their best. And we are mindful of the different contexts in which you may have written it, be it a timed piece that you had to write in a 2-hour time slot, or a piece that you wrote over the period of a week. But in any case, this written work is designed to show you at your best. It may rear its head in interview discussion, so try and remember what it is that you have submitted as written work, because interviewers might ask you about it or they might not. Leads me nicely onto the interviews themselves. Usually at Oxford, you will get 2 interviews at your college. I should say that all interviews, I think I'm right in saying this, all interviews are going to be online, unless there is an extenuating or extraordinary circumstance, in which case you would need to discuss that with your chosen college to which you're applying. But generally speaking, all interviews are online. You would usually get 2 interviews at your chosen college. And again, different colleges sometimes do different things, but usually the format is one of these interviews will be maybe more literary based if you're applying for one of the literary degrees, and maybe your second interview would be more focused either on history or archaeology, so that interviewers get a sense of you in the round and your sort of classical interests in the round. One of the differences between Oxford and Cambridge is that you then might also get subsequent interviews at another college, maybe at a college that you haven't directly applied to. This is so that all the people who deserve a place and who should get a place do in fact get a place. So don't read anything into this if you're invited to interview at another college. This doesn't mean anything beyond the fact that another college is interviewing you and wants to wants to interview. So don't read anything into that. But again, that's a sort of difference, I suppose, between Oxford and Cambridge, that you might get these extra interviews with other colleges that you hadn't initially been expecting. In terms of linguistic aptitude, as I say, there's no longer any admissions tests. That your language aptitude, if you're coming with Latin or Greek, will be folded into the interview process. I think, as Nick was saying, it will be similar for Oxford. These will either be folded into an existing interview or might be at a further sort of language interview. But in any case, that will be folded into the interview process. If you're not coming with Latin or Greek, you would have an interview that tests your linguistic aptitude, as Nick was saying, happens at Cambridge as well. Again, another frequent question is what are interviewers looking for? I think it's fair to say that we want to get the best out of you. We're not trying to trick you in any way. We want you to do well. We're rooting for you. I think that's fair to say. A piece of advice would be always listen to the question that the interviewer has asked. Don't answer a question that you'd like them to have asked, but they didn't. It's okay to sit and think for a moment about the answer. We want to see you at your best. We want to see you responding to information that maybe you haven't dealt with before or thought about before. These are not knowledge tests. We're less interested, obviously we'd like you to have some basic knowledge about the classical world and an interest in the classical world, but we're not interested in how much you know. I think what we're interested in is what you can do when presented with new pieces of information and how you put them together and how you reason things and how you can argue things. I think that's fair to say at both Oxford and Cambridge. As I've already talked about, our typical offers being 3 A's or 39 at IB or equivalent to advanced hires. I think that's everything for applying to Oxford.
I'll take over again. Just to say, the slide there for Oxford said you'll get an offer or a response after interviews in January. Same thing for Cambridge. It's also possible at Cambridge you could have an offer from a different college from the one you applied for, although it's extremely unlikely that you would, it's not completely impossible, it's extremely unlikely that you would get another interview. So there's a difference between Cambridge and Oxford. Okay, what do you get out of studying classics at Cambridge and Oxford? Well, hopefully you have an extremely intellectually satisfying experience where you learn a lot, you enjoy thinking, writing, arguing about subjects that you really enjoy connected to the ancient world. But if we're thinking about sort of transferable skills, in a sense, well, I've given you some things up here that we hope you learn from being here. What I would say is, I think both at Oxford and Cambridge, we pretty much give you an unmatched experience of learning on your own, going off, learning about something off your own back that you quite possibly knew more or less nothing about before that week. And over the course of that week, you will become more or less an expert on that topic, and you will be able to write persuasively and discursively on that topic to a length of 1,500, 2,000. By the time you get to the final years, sometimes it's hard for tutors or supervisors to stop you getting up even higher. And then argue in a civil way with your peers and a teacher at the end of the week. And I think there are tons and tons of jobs, get onto that on the next slide, that is relevant for, right? I often think in terms of law, quite a lot of our students go off and do a law conversion course and then become lawyers of one sort or another. That kind of training is, it seems to me, a perfect training for that kind of thing. But there's all sorts of walks in life, jobs that this kind of training is useful for. You have become someone who is an independent thinker, someone who can talk both to your peers and to people often significantly older and more experienced than you, and developed, as the slide says, things like problem-solving skills and, of course, linguistic skills. Any employer will know that you are capable, especially if you're someone who did the 4-year course, that you are someone who is capable of really dedicating themselves to hard work and mastering something that is quite difficult, which is learning 1 or 2 new languages. Did you want to add something?
As well, I mean, just as a footnote to what Nick was saying, one of the things that the Oxbridge courses give is the ability to deal with and process and cope with a lot of information in a short space of time. And any, line manager or, boss at work, or if we're talking about transferable skills, that is a quality that I think will be something that's looked for. It also, one of the other things is that it means that you can deal with information that's fragmentary and incomplete. One of the things, for better or worse, about the ancient world is that we don't have as much of it as we want. So one of the skills that you will accumulate is what to do when you don't have the full picture, and how do you create a story from incomplete information. I think this is another really valuable skill. And again, just to speak to one of the things that Nick mentioned, is it will give you a sort of power of analysis, power of interpretation about other people, other situations, other cultures. The exercises that we do for 3 or 4, even 5 years in some of these courses will train you in how to sort of process things that are unfamiliar. And I think in our world, that's something that's pretty key.
So, all of this leads on to a vast array of careers. The careers that are on this slide are all things that our students have gone on to do. Essentially, the answer is everything. I don't see fashion in that list, but I have taught someone who went on to work in fashion. They didn't take their fashion tips from me, I hasten to add.
I was implying that they did.
I see. Well, yeah, that was kind of you, but untrue. Something that we haven't mentioned is that Cambridge and Oxford have a vast array of extracurricular clubs and activities that you can be involved in, often both at the college level and the university level, which is quite nice because you can kind of start off small if you want and then work your way up if you want. I had a former student who, when he left had offers from Hermès, again, the fashion house, although he was not a designer, and also a startup which did some kind of political analysis that I confess I didn't really understand. But in the end, he actually went off and worked for a charity which helps people who come from backgrounds that are not necessarily well represented at university apply to and get into university. So he had a huge array of possible options. I think we probably stop here, and that way we'll have a bit of time for questions. But if you want any further information, you can, of course, look at our websites and find out details there of who to contact to ask questions about. But here, in 10 minutes' time, we will, apart from the questions that you're very welcome to ask now, we will have stands set up on the stage here for Cambridge for you to come and ask questions, including our student helpers. For Oxford, I think they're going to be in the foyer, so there'll be lots of opportunities to ask questions here as well. So we come to an end there. Thank you for your patience in listening to us, telling you all these things, and I would like to ask if anyone has any questions. A brave soul. Yes. Fantastic. Thanks. Is Cambridge more focused on Latin than it is on Greek? No, absolutely not. We start off with Latin if you haven't had, if you don't have Latin or Greek when you come. Really just because starting two languages from scratch right at the same time is a little bit daunting. So we start off with Latin, but once we start up with Greek, that runs in parallel with the Greek, and the aim is to get you up to the same level of Latin and Greek by the end of the third year, Part 1B, if you're doing the four-year course. And in our options that aren't, about learning language, absolutely we cover Latin and Greek equivalently. Yeah, thanks for your question. Yeah, and then just in front of you. You.
For ancient history archaeology, at Oxford, how much philosophy do you get?
That is a good question. Off the top of my head, I can't say for certain, but I believe there is an option in the second and third year where you might be able to choose a philosophy option, but that could be wrong. But that is a good question. If I can rephrase that, you would have far more scope to do philosophy, for example, on the Literae Humaniores course than you would in the classical archaeology and ancient history course.
There was a hand. Yeah, okay. What I would say, the question was, are there any things that aren't on the curriculum that you would recommend to increase your chances of being accepted? My answer to that would be that there is no list of things we want you to do. There is no list of books we want you to have read. There is no list of museums we want you to have gone to. But what we are looking for is genuine interest and enthusiasm about the classical world, and whatever way you show that is sort of fine by us, right? So it might be that there's a podcast series that you really like listening to. It might be that you're really interested in ancient drama, and every chance you get, you go to a theatre to watch it, or you look at the archives of the Greek play in Cambridge. There's what's it called? The archive of the archive of ancient drama in Oxford, and you have a look at those. That firstly demonstrates your interest and enthusiasm to us. Secondly, of course, it gives you something to talk about. It gives us something to ask you about if you mention it on your UCAS form, and it gives you a certain knowledge base to make you feel confident in dealing with further, any other information we might throw at you or questions we might ask you about. So it's great to show enthusiasm in some specific way. Follow your interests, and that's what we'd love to see. Is that a fair?
Yeah, anything that has sparked a genuine interest you in the classical world, that's what we're interested in. Yeah, there's no list.
Well, tons of hands now. The first one I saw was in the middle there in the sort of whitish top, yeah.
In more specifically the Oxford Classics and Foreign Language course, is there still a really heavy focus on the philosophy and literature and history portion, or is that a bit more taken by the...
It's not a heavy focus. These are primarily, but not exclusively, literary courses. There is the option and flexibility to do some of these other disciplines, but these are, I think it's fair to say, primarily literary and linguistic courses, but with flexibility.
Yes, over there.
For AMH at Oxford, how much weight is placed on ancient stuff compared to modern?
It's, yeah, good question. There is a balance. It's a reasonably equipoised balance.
Yeah.
What's the scope for looking at like classical reception within both of the courses?
Yeah, so in Cambridge terms, so the question is about classical reception. In Cambridge terms, we have got mini modules in classical reception at 1B, so the second or third year, depending on what you've come in with. Then again, we have, so one of our literary options at part 2, the final year, is currently about the reception of Ovid and how you go about translating Ovid. We also have an array of papers at part 2 which are sort of interdisciplinary and or reception E. So the answer is a fair amount.
Similarly, at Oxford, there's a paper at Greats called Reception. Sorry, I can't see who asked the question.
There.
Yeah. There's a paper called Reception, which will allow you to look at the reception of classical literature in 20th century.
Would you say it's more scope at Cambridge then, compared to Oxford?
Well, so there's certainly that paper at Greats. There's also the option if you wanted to do a thesis on a reception topic. So you could conceivably do 2 of your 8 Greats papers that were reception-oriented. So that's 1/4 of the Greats course, but not that we're quantifying, but... Yeah.
There was previously, yes, blue jumper wearer.
I was wondering if you could go into a bit more detail about like the philosophical part in classics and Cambridge and what it entails.
So there was more questions about, that was more about the philosophical part of the course in Cambridge. Well, here you've hit me on my weak spot because I have the least to do with philosophy probably than any other aspect. In terms of quantification, you can do a lot of it. So essentially, it could be 1/4 of your efforts in the first year or first 2 years, going up to something more like half your efforts in 1B and 100% of your efforts at part 2. So there's a lot of it. The papers are predominantly, if not entirely, focused on looking at ancient philosophy. So it is, there is less in the way of looking at sort of modern philosophy than I think would be the case at Oxford. Is that, you can still do papers on Descartes and that sort of thing at Oxford?
There is the scope at Oxford for doing up to, well, certainly in the Lit Hum course, doing up to 5 philosophy papers of your 8 at Greats, some of which would need to be ancient and some of which could be modern as well.
Yes. Wow, almost too many hands to count. Yeah, someone wearing a black jumper there, yeah. Well, so can you, we're talking about borrowing papers from other degrees. I mean, at Cambridge, we kind of are the classics. There is just the one classics degree, really. So papers that you can borrow are from courses that we think are relevant to you as a student of the classical world. So there's a wide range of papers, things like, for example, historical linguistics. I mentioned Akkadian from, sort of Sumerian Babylonian cultures. Those tragedy from the English paper. You can do papers in modern Greek, for example. So they're all things that are sort of relevant to you as a classicist. But we are the ones doing the kind of classical papers. Things are perhaps a bit more complicated in Oxford.
Well, I think given the range of courses available, we do have that flexibility. I mean, you wouldn't be able, for example, to do a paper in quantum physics as one of your finals papers. But yeah, given the courses available, that there's scope for ranging beyond what you might consider to be hard classics, as it were.
On the screen there, it's an ancient monument in southern France, a handy map provided by me too. The name of this monument is the Tropaeum Alpium, or the Trophy of the Alps. And it stands at a place called La Tourbie, which is on the heights above Monaco. And at the heart of Monaco is Monte Carlo and its casino, which I'll hardly mention again, so my title is utterly misleading. Better get used to it. Also, this talk, contrary to all appearances, is actually about Roman literature, which is the only thing that I'm really qualified to talk about, and some of my colleagues would dispute even that much. But what I want to show is that all the various disciplines that exist within classics, archaeology, history, art history, literature, all of them can combine into a rich picture of antiquity. And I would claim that that approach, that holistic approach, is typical of my university, of Oxford University. But I will get some literature at some point if people feel short-changed. Anyway, so Trophy of the Alps here dates to 12 BC, as you can see, and it's a monument dedicated to the Emperor Augustus. It probably didn't look quite like it currently looks in antiquity, and I don't mean that it would look a bit more complete. I mean that it's been reconstructed. It was reconstructed in the first half of the 20th century in a somewhat imaginative way. Right. Yeah. I love slides that work. It's fantastic. Right. Don't count my chickens, of course. Right. Specifically, the Tropaeum, the trophy, commemorated Augustus's pacification of the Alps, the military control that, under his auspices, under his sort of general command, that had been achieved over the sort of border territory of Italy, the mountains that surround the north of Italy. This monument had an inscription on it, an inscription that listed all the Alpine peoples that it was claimed had been subjugated. And that inscription doesn't survive, it only survives in tiny fragments, but luckily it was recorded by Pliny the Elder in his massive encyclopedic piece of writing, the Natural History. Here you have that inscription. It's basically a long list of people you haven't heard of before. If you have, respect, but they're all in the Alps, but were in the Alps. Just one thing to note before we move on, though, is that Pliny, at this point in his account, is at the very end of a long description of Italy. He sort of moved all the way around Italy, talking about Italy, and then comes the Trophy of the Alps and concludes his account of Italy. For Pliny, the Trophy of the Alps is the kind of end point of Italy. It's where Italy is rounded off. Now, what am I talking about? Because on the map I gave you before, it's in France. But Monte Carlo, I said I wouldn't mention Monte Carlo again. There you go, I told you not to believe me. Monte Carlo is a place in French territory, broadly speaking. The princes of Monaco would have something to say about that probably, but it's a place with an Italian name, and it sort of tells you that this territory has been sort of shared or swapped between France and Italy for quite some time. But in ancient times, it was in Italy, it was the last point of Italy. Okay, so here is Italy looking a bit like a psychedelic head of broccoli, is the best way I could describe it. But you hopefully will get a sense with my, again, astonishingly useful arrow. That's about the only thing I've managed on PowerPoint is the arrow. It sometimes goes in the wrong direction, but you know. Hopefully you get a sense there of that the Tropaeum is like at the very end of the Alps. The Alps sweep round and you get to Monaco, but also at the very edge of Italy too, at the very border of Italy. So Augustus has brought peace to the Alps, but he's also kind of finalized the peace that he's brought to Italy too. There's a little bit more going on with the Tropaeum, though. It's clear from a whole bunch of ancient authors, which I'm sparing you a whole bunch of ancient authors and just giving you one of them instead, the 4th century AD CE historian Ammianus. But it's clear from these authors that Monaco, the harbour, which is at the heart of Monaco, but also the heights above it where La Tourbe and the monument is, all of this area was strongly associated with the god-hero Hercules. That's essentially what Ammianus says at that point, but I could cite lots of other people who say the same thing. In other words, if Augustus is getting a monument, and strictly speaking, this monument is being given to him by the Senate, then Augustus is being identified with Hercules in a space that is very associated with Hercules. What you have on this book, this 19th century book, is an image of what the Tropaeum used to look like before it was kind of embellished in the first half of the 20th century. A reminder also in the Latin, which I've under the Romans on the Riviera, which is a great title for a book, I should say. I've translated that at the bottom. It's a description of Monaco, and it says, "Thus far Italy, henceforth France." So we're right on the border here. And in that little passage of Ammianus as well, it mentions Hercules as a builder of roads, a builder of communications. And another example of my, what can you describe it but as art? The red line that I've drawn across this map of La Tourbe. It's a road built by Augustus which kind of weaves underneath the Tropaeum. So Augustus is like Hercules as well in that he's building a road through the Alps. He couldn't build the road through the Alps until he'd pacified the Alps, is kind of the implication. Right, a little bit more on Hercules. Where are we in his story? Well, if you're inclined to count the labours of Hercules, this is number 10. He's on the way back, or yes, I guess back from from rescuing Gerion's cattle. I mean, they're not much use to Gerion by this point. Taking them back to Greece, to Argos. There's an astonishing wealth of myth associated with Hercules' movement to where Gerion was in southern Spain and back again. What we're talking about in Monaco is just one part of that myth. Rapidly also, though, sorry for the huge chunk of text with sort of useless underlining certain points, I will summarize it for you. This is to try and explain why Hercules, became associated with things like road building. In the second paragraph there, and in particular in the bit that I've underlined, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, I can say that, I promise, sort of rationalizes the myths of Hercules as he goes to Gerion and comes back to Gerion, killing monsters as he goes. Rationalizes them as actually a description of an individual who came and brought civilization to the place. Hercules' core quality, if we can call it a quality, I hardly need to tell you, was his strength. And he's not averse to a little bit of violence at times, violence in the form of monster killing or in the form of breaking down barriers. But what Dionysius gives us here is something different, something developed from that. A powerful individual who uses his strength to build roads, yes, but also bring people together who otherwise would not be brought together, who makes wasteland habitable. Roads, I'm having to move through this far too quickly, but roads aid communication between people. That makes them a very Herculean thing to do, because he's all about mixing people up and making civilization out of that mix. In the first paragraph there, Dionysius just makes the point that Hercules is a particularly popular deity in Italy, which might be relevant later. Okay, very, very rapidly here. Another thing that Hercules did on his travels to and from Spain was have children by lots of royal women as he went on his way. You have two examples of this from Parthenius and from Plutarch. These children might be the beginning of whole peoples. So in case there was ever any doubt that I was descended from Hercules, there is Hercules having by a woman called Celtine, a son called Celtus, from whom descended all the Celts. Nice to know. But also Hercules could give rise to the ruling dynasty of a people. And that's what we're getting here on the other side in Tangier, in modern Morocco, where he has, by the woman Tinga, an individual called Sophax, who's treated as the ancestor of the king of Mauritania, Juba II. Now, I'll just sort of throw out at this point that this is Hercules a little bit like Aeneas in the Aeneid, because Aeneas in the Aeneid is both an ancestor of all Romans and the ancestor of Julius Caesar and Augustus in particular. And their ancestor by virtue of coming from abroad and having children by a local princess called Lavinia. We will come back to the Aeneid, but we're going to go indirectly through some other literature, Roman literature, Augustan literature. Horace, first of all. Horace wrote 4 books of odes. Odes are basically lyric poetry, and I'm going to do something, I'm sorry, Horace, I'm going to summarize outrageously here, but lyric poetry is about saying, drink wine, enjoy yourself, because you don't live very long. Horace did it to rather better, and at rather greater length than that, but that's what lyric poetry is essentially about. I fear I've put you off reading Horace. Horace is just fantastic, okay? Just, yeah, okay. Carpe diem, say no more, wonderful stuff. The first 3 books of Horace's odes were apparently published together, right? While the 4th book seems to have been written rather later and towards the end of his life. The 4th book is a rather remarkable book because it has this strong sense of finality about it. Horace represents himself as being at the end of his career, but also other things are getting wrapped up too. Augustus has brought peace to Rome in a kind of definitive way. Well, within this book of 15 poems, there are 2 poems that are essentially devoted to the conquest of the Alps by Tiberius and Drusus, Augustus's stepson. So the same thing as is being commemorated at the trophy. Why? Because the conquest of the Alps was a kind of a capstone to the peace that Augustus had brought to Italy. So Horace is kind of, in a different mode, saying the same thing as the trophy may be. Ovid, and a peculiar moment in his Metamorphoses. There are plenty of peculiar moments in the Metamorphoses. That's what's brilliant about the Metamorphoses. The centaur Nessus, at this point, is trying to run off with Hercules' wife Deianira, and Hercules objects texts. But you can perhaps see from the very large writing on the screen there, and what I've done with certain parts of it, that Hercules' language is rather commercial, financial, as he addresses Nessus. As if Deianira has become a commodity and Nessus into some kind of fraudster or thief. Why is this happening? Well, one place you can go to contemplate this, and I did, and I took a photo, is the Temple of Hercules at Tivoli, which doesn't quite look like it does in this model anymore, but is a remarkable place. You can see perhaps a road. The main road is running through it. That makes sense. A Temple of Hercules should have a road running through it. We've done that already. But the whole temple was a commercial banking centre, an absolute sort of focus of industry. This was because a natural development of being a road builder and a bringer of people together is that Hercules was a god of trade, particularly, I think, in Italy. Some etchings, incidentally, there by Piranesi. That's the road coming through at the top. Piranesi was slightly obsessed with the place. What is Ovid doing? What was Ovid doing, though? Well, Ovid was doing what Ovid always does, making a joke of things. But his joke is that Hercules is just a god, he's just a businessman in divine form. And even when his wife is being stolen, he's looking at the receipt, kind of thing. Good. Okay. We don't have to find that joke funny, of course. We're jumping that one because I don't have time. Good. A whiz through Virgil's Aeneid now. Now, I've already suggested, I think, that Aeneas resembles Hercules quite closely in Aeneas's role as an ancestor, whether an ancestor of Augustus or an ancestor of the Romans in general. Virgil works on a connection between Aeneas and Hercules quite consistently, particularly in the second half of the poem, but not just in the second half of the poem. But the moment in the Aeneid where Hercules features most of all is, or most extensively, is in Book 8 when there is a long account of Hercules killing a monster, Hercules killing a monster plaguing Rome called Carcas. It's a passage where Hercules is at his most unapologetically violent. It's Hercules at his most brutal, even as he is fighting a very brutal monster himself in Carcas. But despite that really quite challenging representation of Hercules, as we come out of this story, we have Hercules described by Evander, the king of Rome that Aeneas is visiting at this point, in quite striking terms. I put the Latin in there just because it is quite a memorable expression. He calls Hercules the communis deus. And communis is a very rich Latin word. It means something that is shared by everyone. And it's a sort of peculiar thing to say about a god hero who's just been described destroying another being. But Virgil wants us to contemplate it, I think. Okay. Some thoughts on Aeneas as Hercules, or some illustrations of it. The famous moment where he picks up his father and carries his father out of Troy, and Virgil just slips in the detail of the lion skin that he places over his shoulder. That's an unmistakable Herculean image. In actual fact, whenever Aeneas puts something on his shoulders, whether it's his father, the future, who's also the past, everything, you know, or the shield, which describes the future of Rome, as he does in Aeneid 8. He looks like Hercules, who's particularly well known for taking things on his shoulder, the sky, when he sent Atlas to get the apples of the Hesperides, for example. So, efforts to make Aeneas look like Hercules. But a peculiarity of Hercules in the Aeneid, and it brings us back to other things we've been saying about Hercules, is that he isn't just linked to Aeneas, and isn't just linked to figures on Aeneas's side of the conflict that fills the second half of the poem. Now, he is associated with Pallas, who's Aeneas's protege, and you have on the right-hand side Pallas praying to Hercules as he is about to fight Turnus, and Hercules knowing what's going to happen, and he weeps, which is something that Hercules doesn't very easily do. So, you know, that is maintained, that association with Aeneas's side. But on the other side, on the left-hand side, you have a passage from the beautiful litany of Latin warriors that are on Turnus's side that you get at the end of the 7th book. And a figure called Aventinus, whose name associates him very strongly with Rome, who's the son of Hercules. So Hercules has a son who is fighting against Aeneas. And at the bottom there, from Aeneid 10, you have a couple of figures who are killed by Aeneas, and they turned out to be very closely associated with Hercules too. So Hercules is a communis deus. He's a god who's shared by everybody, but the strange thing is that he's shared by both sides of a conflict that are fighting for control and fighting very brutally for control. He is the god of everyone. Okay, well, how does that work? It's extremely difficult, but Virgil seems to suggest that Aeneas's violence, his victory over Turnus, will bring peace and harmony to Italy. That seems to be an implication of the poem. And Hercules is another figure who somehow is all about breaking things, all about violence, but also somehow gives us civilization. Very mysterious. But if you think about Hercules in the Aeneid, you encounter, I think, one of the fundamental problems of the Aeneid, the fundamental difficulties of the Aeneid. However, to conclude, the Aeneid is certainly interested in Italy, certainly interested in Italy's conflicts, both ancient and more recent when Virgil was writing. And Augustus was very interested in the conflicts within Italy. What his primary concern was to bring peace to Italy and to know and to make sure that people knew that he had brought peace to Italy. So the monument at Monaco and Virgil's Aeneid are, through Hercules, speaking something like the same language. It's a different kind of language from the language that the monument is speaking with Horace or Ovid, but something like that. Now, if we can make an archaeological site in southern France speak to literary texts in any good library, then we're doing something that Oxford, not just Oxford, but Oxford is who I represent, so Oxford likes to do. We're the largest classics faculty on the planet. I bashed the table there just to make it clear. That's quite Herculean, wasn't it? No, he'd break it probably. And our courses invite you to study every aspect of the Greco-Roman world, to study the philosophy, the history, the archaeology, the linguistics, the literature, the stuff I've forgotten. And if you mix them all together and create something bigger, like Hercules, all the better. Thank you very much indeed. Absolutely.
Love it when that happens. Okay, can everyone hear me? At the back, can you hear me? Is that working at all? Hello? No? No, that one not either. Can you hear me now? No. Okay, I'm just going to shout very loudly. Can you hear me now? Excellent. All right. Always the best solution. When the tech doesn't work, just shout. Okay, thank you all very much for coming along this afternoon. Especially, I hope you've had a chance to get some lunch. I know this is a long stream of talks for you, but thanks very much for coming along. So I'm Shishma Malik. I'm a Roman historian here in the Classics faculty at Cambridge. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of a taster lecture on something that, a part of the Roman Empire that we can kind of think of as something that relates also to debates and discussions that we have around politics and big issues of political systems now as well. And that's the Roman Empire and proto-nationalism. That is working. Yeah, okay, great. Suddenly very loud. That's Roman Empire and proto-nationalism, which I put in sort of brackets because nationalism is a difficult term, of course, to apply to an ancient society. But what I want to do in this session today is just give a little bit of a taster or a bit of a sense of why it might be important to think through some of these questions, even when they might seem to us initially anachronistic. Okay, so my first example or reason for why it's interesting to think through some of these things is because actually, whether we like it or not, the Roman Empire has often been caught up and become a part of debates that have to do with questions of nationhood, identity, inheritance, nationalism to some extent as well, that have come up in the last, hundreds of years of scholarship, but can sometimes still embed in our own society, in our own political discourse. I'm going to give you some examples that come from scholarship, so situating it within academia, but we might also think of other debates that are had in modern political environments, in newspapers, all sorts of things that think about, what it is to be patriotic, what it is to be a citizen, what national identity, means in the 21st century, and how it can be used for various causes. So the first bit I've got for you here today is from Francis Haverfield, who was a Roman historian himself. He was the first inaugural lecturer of the Roman Society, which some of you may know in London. He helped to found that society. And he coined this term, I think he coined it, or he was very famous for having written a lot about this term, Romanization. And it's one I'll come back to at the end as well, but just to kind of make you familiar with what it means. So for him, and this is quite an outdated, you'll understand, view, but for him, it was the growth of an internal civilization which formed the second and most lasting of the achievements of the empire, talking about the Roman Empire. Its long and peaceable government, the longest and most orderly that has yet been granted to any large portion of the world, gave time for the expansion of Roman speech and manners, for the extension of the political franchise, of the establishment of city life, the assimilation of the provincial populations, and an orderly, coherent civilization. As the importance of the city of Rome declined, as the world became Romeless, a large part of the world grew to be Roman. It has been said that Greece taught men to be human and Rome made mankind civilized. That was the work of the empire. The form it took was Romanization. So there's a lot going on in this quotation, but if we just draw attention to the fact that he really believes and he's really pushing this idea that there was a coherent sense of Roman identity, Roman values that was pushed from the centre of Rome out into the province, and for him actually gave Europe a cohesion that he can then tie into his own time, early 20th century. But what is nationalism? So we can define it not straightforwardly or strictly, but there have been quite a lot of scholarship that kind of tries to think through the concepts and approaches that we might take to defining such a difficult term. This is from the Oxford Handbook of the History of Nationalism. This definition says we can succinctly define the political ideology of nationalism as one which claims that there exists a unique nation, so uniqueness is part of it, as we saw with Haverfield, that this nation has a special value and therefore a right to existence and recognition, and that to secure this right, the nation must possess autonomy, often understood as a sovereign nation state. The most basic tenet of nationalism, the unique nation, is grounded historically. In principle, one could identify a nation non-historically, so genetic makeup, language, foundational moment, but that identity is soon embedded within a unique history, which produced that phenotype, language group, or revolutionary act. So it's quite an expansive definition of nationalism, but again, that really underpins that idea of a uniqueness of a particular nation, but then also that this is embedded in a history that's perpetuated. So the idea that this becomes part of a way that a nation or a group, whatever we might say, defines themselves. Now, it's not just someone like Haverfield who tries to link some of these ideas, back to the Roman Empire. Haverfield talks about Romanization, but we might see in there an argument that is, drawing on many of the same threads as nationalism. This book is from 2011, and Caspar Hershey, the author of it, again, when he's thinking about the origins of nationalism, and you'll see from the title, he starts in ancient Rome, to think about where these ideas and terms come from. Again, not saying that the Roman Empire is an example of nationalism, but that it's useful to think with some of these questions. He says he draws in Rome as an example quite explicitly. So I won't read the whole thing, but just starting from sort of the middle. Imperialist cultures can be described as expansive entities based on the ideal of a single universal power formed by a hierarchical opposition of a civilized self and a barbarian other. As is best known from the Roman Empire, imperialist cultures are able to distinguish between the barbarian collectives, those outside, but even if they do so, they classify them together as uncivilized to assert their fundamental otherness and, in most cases, their profound inferiority to the collective self. On the basis of such unequal bipolarity, a nation of barbarian competitiveness with the civilized world can hardly develop. So it's not possible, really, for them to challenge the world that has been set up by the dominant, this sort of proto-nationalist nation. And he looks to the Roman Empire for examples of this from an early stage. Again, thinking about origins rather than definitions here from that historical perspective. But it's interesting that something as big as the Roman Empire can get caught up in these discussions, despite the fact it is a very, very early system of government. So why? Why does the Roman Empire get caught up in some of these debates to such a great extent? And when I was thinking about this, I was sort of went in a few different directions, but for me, there's two things that really play a key role in sort of thinking about Roman identity are patriotism and citizenship. And what's really important within the debates or discourses, I should say, around these two things is that the writers that we have extant give us this what seems to be a really coherent and a really clear idea that the Romans had these things. They were patriotic, they believed in their fatherland, all about the patria, and also that citizenship was something to be privileged, right? To be understood as marking you out as something that was special, a bit like we've seen with that question of nationalism. So I'm going to give you now a couple of examples of that exceptionalism, if you like, of Rome trying to say it's sort of unique, and then two examples where that's undermined, also by Roman authors, but in slightly different ways. So the first comes from Cicero, who you may have heard of. He's famous in Roman history circles for being someone who writes a lot, apart from anything else. So he, in a sort of essay or a series of essays on duties, De Officiis, talks about how you balance this kind of idea of the fatherland with your actual parents, with the idea of being a citizen, all of those sorts of things. And he sort of makes an argument that the fatherland is the thing that kind of trumps most other aspects of your identity. So in this, it's sort of in a dialogue form. So he says, when there are not any claims of, well then, are there not claims of country, patria, paramount to all other duties? Yes, indeed, but it is to our country's interest to have citizens who are loyal to their parents. Okay, all good. So far, so good. Country and parents. But once more, if the father attempts to make himself a tyrant or to betray his country, shall the son keep his silence? No, of course not. He will plead with his father not to do so. If that accomplishes nothing, he will take him to task, he will even threaten, and in the end, if things point to the destruction of the state, the patria though, he will sacrifice his father to the safety of his country. So as long as you can, try to balance these aspects of your duties, as Cicero is talking about. But when it comes down to it, it's the fatherland, it's your duty to the fatherland, your patriotism, we might say, again, a modern term based on this idea that comes from the patria, the fatherland of ancient Rome. More Cicero on citizenship this time. So, set up Cicero, then I'll break him down, I promise. So this comes from a speech he gives, or actually may not have given. It's a speech he wrote, but was supposed to be given at some point as part of a trial, but the trial didn't quite get this far. So Cicero is making a case against a governor of Sicily named Verres, that he is he mistreats lots of people in lots of ways and does lots of things, but one of the things that Cicero sort of picks up on is this idea that he abused a Roman citizen. So, and he really kind of builds this case. In the open marketplace of Messana in Sicily, a Roman citizen, a civis Romanus, judges, was beaten with rods, and all the while, amid the crack of falling blows, no groan was heard from the unhappy man. No words came from his lips in his agony, except civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen. Thus proclaiming his citizenship, he was hoping to avert all those blows and shield his body from torture, yet not only did he fail to escape from those cruel rods, but when he persisted in his entreaties and his appeals to his citizen rights, to the idea that he is a citizen, nomen civitatis, I am a citizen, a cross was made ready, yes, a cross for that hapless and broken sufferer who had never seen such an accursed thing till then. Of course, crucifixion, a Roman punishment that was used for usually for enslaved people. Cicero continues, does freedom, that precious thing, mean nothing? Nor the proud privileges of a citizen of Rome, nor does the law of Porcius or the laws of Sempronius, nor the tribune's power, whose loss our people felt so deeply till now, at last it has been restored to them. So, what does this mean? If a Roman citizen cannot say, I am a Roman citizen, whatever he might be, or she might be, women were citizens too, in the Roman Empire, what does it mean if that doesn't mean anything anymore? And that's the point that he's trying to make. So citizenship should give you all of these kinds of ideas, all of this protection, all in the idea of being a Roman, civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen. Okay, so that's all well and good for now, but let's think about some other sources. And this is literature that I'm giving you here sort of for the sake of time, but we could also go to much archaeological evidence, material sources that help to complicate this picture as well. And I'll end with just sort of a summary of that, but I just wanted to give you these bits of text too, to give you a sense of kind of where we might go if we wanted to break down some of these sort of nationalistic, proto-nationalistic conceptions of Rome. So the first I wanted to show you is from Livy, again, a historian that might be familiar to you, writing in the Augustan period, so Cicero's sort of the generation beforehand in the late Republic. Livy is in the Augustan period. And what Livy does is he writes this big, long history. We don't have all of it, but, it was huge, that goes right from the foundations of Rome through to his own time, roughly speaking, although, like I say, we've lost vast swathes of it. But we do have his account of the foundation of Rome, the very first kings of Rome. And of course, the first king of Rome is Romulus. And this story is sort of taking place after he's committed fratricide, and Remus is dead, and then he's founded the city. And then he has a problem. He's got this city, but there's no one to live in it. He doesn't have enough inhabitants. And more to the point, he doesn't want to stop, with the city. He has designs on other places, so he needs manpower. He needs to build up the power in the city. So Livy tells us he resorted to a plan for increasing the inhabitants, which had long been employed by the founders of the cities, who gather about them an obscure and lowly multitude and pretend that the earth has raised up sons to them. A dig at Athens there, maybe? Well, I'll leave that to you. In the place which is now enclosed between the two groves as you go up the hill, he opened an asylum. A miscellaneous rabble from the surrounding peoples, without distinction of enslaved or free, fled to the asylum, eager for new conditions. And these constituted the first advance in power towards the greatness at which Romulus aimed. He had now no reason to be dissatisfied with his strength and proceeded to add policy to its strength. He appointed 100 senators, whether because this number seemed to him sufficient or because there were no more than 100 people who were, seemed like they could do the job. At all events, they received the designation of fathers from their rank, and their descendants were called patricians. And there we have the first ruling class in Rome, the patricians. You can see also that title linked to the idea of fathers and pater and patria and so forth. So in Livy, in this foundational story, Rome is made up of people who come from all over the place, people fleeing. You could be enslaved, you could be free. Obviously we know Aeneas himself flees from Troy into Italy. That's where we get generations, hundreds of years later, the Romulus and Remus story, according to mythology. But when Livy is writing down for Romans his own sort of characterization of Rome's origin story, it's not of a single group of unified people who were sprung from the earth. It's of people who fled there to an asylum to take refuge. And that's a very, that's a very powerful way of sort of breaking down perhaps some of the ideas of this, of Rome and its sort of uniqueness, I suppose. Unique in other ways, maybe, but certainly not in terms of having something inbuilt from the beginning. And citizenship, so that's sort of another thing that we can problematize. So Cicero, to be fair to him, in his time, Roman citizenship, if you got Roman citizenship, you would then give up your own local citizenship. So if you were born in another part of Italy, where sort of generations before that, where you had your own local citizenship, or if you were born in Syria or somewhere else, you could keep your own local citizenship, or you could become a Roman citizen if it was gifted gifted to you in various ways, but you had to give up your own in order to take Roman. That stopped. Sometime around the late 1st century BCE, 1st century CE, that stopped. So now you could have more than one citizenship. And we know this because people like Dio Chrysostom sort of use it as a tool to bring people together and to create concord, as this discourse is about, his Orations 41. So he's giving this in front of a council in Apamea to the Apamaeans. And he's saying, look, I'm a citizen, I'm one of you, but I also have all of these other citizenships. So he says, for my grandfather, along with my mother, acquired from the emperor of the day, so from the Roman emperor, who was his friend, not only Roman citizenship, but along with it, citizenship in Apamea too. While my father got citizenship here from you, so grandfather and mother from the emperor, father given it by the Apamaeans. Consequently, I am your fellow citizen by both grace and birth. Again, to my children at least, this is their fatherland. So Dio himself was born in Prusa, but his children seem to have been born in Apamea. He may have been in exile there, but his children were born there. While, therefore, necessity dictates that children follow their father, it is much pleasant for this father to follow his children, i.e. to think also of Apamea as a sort of fatherland. So he's really playing around with this idea that you can be in several places and come from several places and have different citizenships and have all of these different sort of Roman identities, local identities, and so forth. And again, this is a reality that we see in the Roman Empire. I think he probably has more than most, to be fair, but you could have more than one, certainly. Be a Roman citizen and a citizen of Egypt or Alexandria and so forth. So it's an interesting way, again, of sort of breaking down some of those ideas of privileging Roman citizenship. And certainly there would have been many in the Roman Empire who did not really want to, did not need to be Roman citizens at all. They could carry on perfectly happy with their own local citizenship, and probably many did. Okay, just to wrap up, as I run out of time, a last kind of thought for you on this subject. So I've been looking kind of primarily at literature. I'm a bit of a literary historian, but certainly a really fundamental way, again, of breaking down some of the more popular conceptions or some of the ways in which Rome is employed, both in scholarship and elsewhere, is again to think away from just one genre of work. So I've been looking at literature, which is my fault, but you should also go to material culture to think about these questions as well. It never does to just really look at one thing. And that's actually where, of course, a lot of things can go wrong. If you only look at Cicero, you'll only have one view. If you widen your perspective, you will get lots of other views. So this comes from a scholar called Richard Hingley, who's an archaeologist, again, does a brilliant work on this idea of breaking down the assumptions we make about Roman culture. This is from a book he wrote in 2005 that really changed, I think, the shape of this discussion. But he's written many things since then as well. But he says, the idea of Roman identity is useful as a concept of cultural unity that allows the exploration of power relations, but we need to accept that it is only a partial picture of the connections through which the empire was brought into being and maintained. So to get too obsessed with this idea that, Rome as an empire had a cultural unity, yes, there are some things you can explore through that in relation to power, but actually it's not the whole story, it's restrictive. The Roman world did not operate according to the simple and well-established rules, and the ideas that we used to study, it may sometimes collide and contradict, as we've seen. In other words, we need to think further than the useful but simplistic image of Roman identity. So again, what Richard Hingley, as an archaeologist, brings to bear and reminds us as historians, as scholars, as students, as all of these things, is that again, just taking kind of one side of things can be quite difficult to build a whole picture, and also study has to be as wide as possible. But also that we shouldn't fall into the traps that are very, very easy to fall into, and many brilliant people have, of assuming that sort of what we get through one side of a culture isn't contradicted within that same culture, that there aren't lots of different stories going on. And to do that, the Roman Empire is a wonderful thing to do that in, because it is so big and has such a wide range of opinions to explore. Okay, I think that's my 20 minutes up. I will stop there. Thank you all very much for your attention. If you do have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Oh, hello. Hi.
The reason a lot of Roman imagery is used by very nationalist
Yeah, so I was going to start with Elon Musk's Roman salute, but I didn't know how relevant that still is, because, you know, he's gone now, so, well, he's not, but a different situation. But yeah, I think it is really fascinating, because if you do go, and I don't recommend you do this, but if you do go do like a deep dive into some of the sort of, you know, Reddit posts and things that people do write about the Roman Empire, it is held up as a sort of model of conservatism in some ways, a small c conservatism. And then also from that springs discourses about nationalism and all sorts of things, and ideas of that when the Roman Empire expanded and did give more people citizenship and, you know, did all of these things, that's when it started to break down. So because the Roman Empire has such a long lifespan, it can feed into loads of different discourses depending on what you choose. But certainly, I think a lot of the sort of Ciceronian stuff that we have looked at does come up on those kinds of in those kinds of discourses, and for those, you know, looking for those kinds of explanations. So I think that's the thing. Is if you take one aspect of most periods in history, you can sort of tell the story that you like. The Roman Empire is so compelling because it's seen as foundational for so many political systems that we have now. So I think that's, you know, a big part of it as well. Thank you for your question. Oh, just here. Yeah. Thank you. So this is a question about when the Roman Empire split in two, which happens in the late 3rd century. Well, the Emperor Diocletian sets up the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4 emperors, and splits it between East and West. And whether there's a different sense of identity, I suppose, within that. That's an excellent question, and it's fascinating because, I mean, you know, you get another Senate in the East, so you have the one in the West and the one in the East. The best way I think I can, or the quickest way I can answer that now is with a great anecdote from a historian called Ammianus Marcellinus. So he's writing in the 4th century. He's roughly contemporary with the Emperor Julian, who, you know, very briefly takes the Rome back to paganism from Christianity. And he talks about, he gives an account of when he goes with the emperor, at the time one of Constantine's sons, to Rome, and he gets to see all the famous stuff, because they've been in the East, right? They've been in Constantinople, they've been based there. And then suddenly, all the things you read about in your history books as someone from the Eastern Roman Empire, you get to see all of these buildings, and it's like this awe, but then also this kind of sadness, because it's not what it used to be, right? It's not where it is. So I think there is definitely kind of ways we can get behind, you know, that question of differences and changes. But then, of course, the Roman Empire doesn't actually fall until 1453, so in the East. So we can go from kind of, you know, 4th century, 5th century, right the way through to, you know, through the Byzantine, what we call the Byzantine Empire. But of course, they called themselves Romans. And that is a very different, I think, idea of sort of Roman identity again. But thank you so much for your question. Yeah, 2 rows behind. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. So this was a question about how much Romans see themselves in other cultures and societies. So Jugurtha and Sallust in North Africa being one example. I was also thinking when you said that of sort of Tacitus and his versions of people like Caractacus, or, you know, those figures from Rome, or Calgacus actually in the Agricola as well. I think it's a really excellent question, and does also feed into kind of one of the sort of issues, I suppose, is that you have as a historian, which is that sometimes when they're doing that, it's to say something more about themselves and their own culture than anyone else's. So, look how bad Rome has become if people from North Africa and Britain are exhibiting the virtues that we used to have and no longer have. So there's this sort of, narrative or idea of decadence and decline that comes in. Sallust talks about it a lot in the preface to the Catiline as well, and the idea of moral decay in Rome. So I think, there's that. Having said that, I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think, I'm sure there were things that they recognised that was very similar with other, you would. Common sense sort of dictates that, of course, they would have. And again, I think Richard Hingley is so important here because not only does he sort of think about, the idea of Roman culture, and break that down. But he also thinks about the multiple ways in which other parts of the empire influenced Rome. So the things that Rome gets from everyone else. And not just, Greek art, which is one example, but so many kind of aspects of culture and society that are, influenced by religion. For example, think of kind of temple cults and all sorts of things that come from different parts of the Roman Empire. So thank you, that's an excellent question. I've got time for one more. Yeah, at the back. Yeah.
I was just wondering how their identity of nationalism differs from, say, belief in your city-state.
Yeah.
Because often people from Athens will refer to it as the
Yeah.
Yeah,
no, excellent question. So this was a question about what extent Rome is sort of unique in this in any way, in sort of thinking about your city-state or your state as being, something that is tied to your identity. So Athens and being an Athenian is another example. I think you could certainly talk about Athens, and especially because they do have very different sort of foundational stories to this. It's interesting that it doesn't, and I think you're right, I think you could certainly do the same thing with Athens as I've just done with Rome, and think about the relationship that they have to the idea of being Athenian. I think what I find interesting, though, is it's far less frequent for Athens to come up in later ideas of how people are trying to think about nationalism. So the Roman Empire comes up much more, I think I think there are lots of reasons for that, but Athens generally tends to occupy a place that has to do with democracy, right? That's what we remember, that's what we go to with Athens. What we go to with Rome is much more homogenizing. We like to think of sort of the way in which Rome managed to keep an empire going for, 1,000 years, if we want to be generous. So I think because of that, these sorts of explorations tend to be filtered more through Rome than through Athens. But you're absolutely right that you could certainly say, in antiquity, the idea of your polis in relation to Athens is supremely important, and your citizenship and your tribe, right, and the deme and all the rest of it. So it is a very clearly there too. It's just we get less obsessed about it with Athens. Okay, I think I am out of time, I'm sorry. But thank you all so very much for coming along and for your excellent questions as well.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Adrian Kelly. I'm a professor of ancient Greek literature at the University of Oxford, and I'm a tutor at Balliol College, Oxford 2. Please don't blame us for Boris Johnson. It happened well before my time. All right, so when Peter Hegseth, this guy, the current US Secretary of State for War, got up in front of the world's press the other day to talk about the airstrikes on Iran, what he said was as noticeable as the way that he said it. Having elsewhere promised to, quote, unleash overwhelming and punishing violence on America's enemies, he spoke about, quote, punching the enemy when he's down, and kept returning to the notion of the warrior. US soldiers, sailors, and airmen were our warriors, driven by a warrior ethos, which would not be constrained by stupid rules of engagement. They would not fight politically correct wars. It was all a little bit welcome to the warrior dome. Now, Hegseth has made a successful career out of this kind of discourse, and reactions to him have been somewhat predictable. Many of the professional classes, people like me, regard him as something of a clown, and they constantly underestimate the appeal which he and others of his ilk have on all sides of the political spectrum. And this reaction is really the point of my talk to you this afternoon. Let me give you an example. Almost a year ago, the humorist Marina Hyde skewered Hegseth and the rest of Trump's cabal in The Guardian, suggesting that, quote, they should really make a darkly satirical TV show about these absurd, degenerate, unpleasant people. We should call it the White POTUS. Now, that's a good joke, but the disdain with which she treats them is really what I want to be talking to you about. Because it's the same kind of reaction which stood apart in befuddled amazement when Donald Trump was voted into the White House twice. And I think it stems from an inability or an unwillingness to look honestly at humanity, the good, the bad, and the very ugly, and to try to understand why, specifically, this kind of discourse appeals to so many people. And here, because I'm a classicist, is my predictable turn to the ancient world, to Homer, the fons et origo, and, at the same time, the absolute summit of all ancient Greek and Roman literature. Neither he nor his first audiences in archaic Greece would have been surprised by the kind of language which Hyde decries and Hegseth delivers. In fact, they would have understood it viscerally and instinctively. The whole of the Iliad, after all, is structured around 4 days of fighting on the Trojan plain, fighting in which continuous narrative of physical, deadly combat forms the background, and more often than not, the foreground. From the start of Book 2 to midway through Book 22, violence becomes poetry, and more than a third of the entire poem is spent on descriptions and narratives of fighting. Scholars routinely write almost apologetically about this kind of thing, noting that modern audiences don't really like to read these portions of the poem, focusing as they do instead on episodes like the meeting between the Trojan Hector, his wife Andromache, and his son Astyanax in Book 6, where the returning warrior and his family reunite briefly and reflect on the tenuousness of human life. Or modern readers flock, as did the great Irish poet Michael Longley in his masterpiece Ceasefire, to the scenes between Priam and Achelous in Book 24, as the young hero and the aged king on opposite sides of the war manage to find some kind of peaceful rapprochement for a moment in the midst of all the death that has been told and is to come. Longley's recreation of the scene is worth pondering here, and in general, really, it's a wonderful, wonderful poem. Written just days after the IRA announced a ceasefire in Northern Ireland in 1994 to put an end to more than 20 years of paramilitary violence, Longley has commented that the poem was meant to argue the inevitability of forgiveness, especially in its closing couplet, I get down on my knees and do what must be done, and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son. But there are some elements of the Iliadic episode which make no appearance in Longley's work, and perhaps understandably so, given what he was trying to do. Homer has Achilles taunt Priam, for instance, after the handing over of Hector and before he sets him down to sleep. And before any of this had happened, when Priam tried to leave Achilles' tent without supping alongside his new host, the younger man had threatened him with imminent violence, reducing the old king to a hapless and fearful silence. Perhaps more important, however, is the understanding in the Homeric scene that this meeting, however powerful, indeed however beautiful, is but a momentary pause in the violence. Troy is to fall soon, Priam will be slaughtered in the city's sack, the rest of the men killed, the women raped, the children butchered or taken into slavery. This honest appraisal of the situation and its characters often seems not to strike a lot of modern readers and critics, and perhaps we shy away from it with Longley because it's uncomfortable. We want hope. We want to see a change in Achilles over the course of the poem, an awareness that human life should be more important than the kinds of damaging struggles over honour and property which typify the ancient Greek heroic world, amongst some others, of course. But there isn't a change in him. For Homer and his audiences, there couldn't really be. These values drove the characters in this world, where violence is a constant, and the ability to mete it out is a central and approved value. When the aged counsellor Phoenix tells us that he had been sent to Troy along with Achilles, he says, "And the old man, the horse-driver Peleus, sent me to you on that day when he sent you from Thea to Agamemnon, a child not yet knowing of destructive war, nor of assemblies where men become noticeable. So he sent me to teach you all these things, to be a speaker of words and a doer of deeds." And here he outlines perfectly what it means to be an Homeric leader, dominating the assembly by speaking decisively, dominating the battlefield by fighting. The importance of these two qualities is stressed again and again and throughout all early Greek epic. The Trojan ally and the Lycian hero Sarpedon, for instance, was said to protect Lycia with his judgments and with his strength, whilst Odysseus cites his superiority in thinking to counterbalance Achilles' greatest strength in the assembly of Book 19. "You are stronger than I am and mightier by not a little with the spear, but I am far ahead of you in thinking, since I was born before and no more." This is often an argument I have to use with my children now. So this capacity for authoritative violence is central to Homer's world. Yet again, we almost try our best not to see it. For instance, in the very famous scene in Book 18, when the god Hephaestus makes a new shield for Achilles, the god creates on it a series of images representing almost the whole of human life. Cities at peace and war, farming, harvesting, hunting, stars in the sky, the ocean. Many critics look at this array and think of it as representing the peaceful world outside the nasty violence of the Iliad, the life which Achilles has chosen to leave behind in his pursuit for martial glory. But they neglect the somewhat important fact that the images of the city at war, a siege, the plundering of flocks, pitched battles, the killing of shepherds, form the largest single illustration on the shield, right at its centre. In Homer's world, whether we like it or not, violence is everywhere. And this isn't just my own quasi-fascistic reading. In a Roman-era text called The Contest of Homer and Hesiod, which stems back probably to Athens in the 4th century BCE, the two great epic poets of Greece meet up for a poetic contest in the court of a king Panoides, whose name in Greek literally means know-it-all. Now, one after the other, they compare their best lines, or they respond to questions with poetic answers. And Homer throughout is Kendrick Lamar to Hesiod's Drake. Thank you, my daughter did not think that joke was going to land. All right. Until, as the final test, each poet is asked by the king to sing what they think of as their finest verse. Homer gives us a passage from Book 13 of the Iliad, which describes the massed fighting tactics of the Greek troops. These verses today are no one's idea of his best work. And in fact, hardly anyone nowadays reads this portion of the poem at all. And yet here they are, presented in an influential ancient discussion of Homer's merits as his own choice of his very best. And in the context of the contest of Homer and Hesiod, they strike the audience as well as the clinching proof of Homer's excellence. Although King Know-It-All decides that Hesiod, as the poet of peace, rather than Homer, as the poet of war, should take the first prize. Now, I'm going to try to illustrate this notion, the notion that violence can be art, or at least that Homer thought that it could, by reference to another entirely forgettable passage. Not something from Achilles' rampage over the battlefield, or anything from the death scenes of any of the major heroes. That would be far too easy to do. And one of the purposes of my talk is to stress how normalised, how quotidian almost, is Homer's approach to poeticised violence. So the passage on the screen is deeply unimportant for the rest of the poem. It falls shortly after Paris and Hector rejoin the fighting at the end of Book 6 and represents the resumption of the nastiness after the brief digression in Troy itself. Let me just read it. Then the two of them killed. One killed the son of King Aretheus, Menesthius, who dwelt in Arne, who was born of the mace man Aretheus and ox-eyed Philo Medusa. And Hector with his sharp spear struck Aeoneus on the neck, below the well-made helmet of bronze, and loosed his limbs. And Glaucus, son of Hippolochus, leader of the Lycians, made a cast with his spear in the mighty combat at Iphinus, son of Dexius, springing onto his chariot behind his swift mares, and struck him on the shoulder. He fell from his chariot to the ground, and his limbs were loosed. Now, what I want you to note here is the poetic effort which has gone into this passage. Now, it's all the same event, in one sense, generated 3 times. 1, 2, 3. But none of these deaths is precisely like the other. Each is different, each interesting in itself. To start with, we don't know who the first victor is, since the preceding narrative simply lumps together Hector and Paris. Then the two of them killed, or one killed, who was the one. So we're left in suspense about his identity until Hector kills his man in verse 11. The third killer is initially a surprise. He hadn't been mentioned in the previous narrative, and he receives a whole verse to identify him. Each killing method, for instance, moreover, receives different levels of description. We aren't told how Paris struck his victim or with what. Of Hector, we get the fact that he was striking with the sharp spear, as we do for Glaucus. But the poet's attention here is more on his genealogy and his rank, neither of which he is bothered with in the cases of Paris and Hector. Each of the victims is also varied, and not just by name. Of the first, we learn his home, his parents, and the particular weapon favoured by his dad. Of the second, we learn where he was struck and what happened once he'd been struck. Of the third, his patronymic, what he was doing when he was struck, where he was struck, and what happened after he was struck. See, it's very easy to lose track of all this killing. Now, Homer wasn't just doing this in order to fill in space or to get himself ready for the next marquee moment of pathos. He knew that his audience would be interested in a blow-by-blow description of the fighting, and so he bothered to vary almost every aspect of it every single time. And he did this not just in the big scenes, for the big duels, the big moments, but even in a passage like this, which has no dramatic significance for the poem as a whole. Now, how typical was this narrativizing? I'm really sorry about the word. But how typical was this narrativizing of violence in early Greek poetry, you might wonder? Though almost nothing of heroic martial epic survives apart from Homer, what we do have suggests that he was not unusual. The Little Iliad has many scenes of combat, both before and during the sack of the city, and the slightly later Shield of Heracles absolutely revels in the conflict between Ares and Heracles. We can surmise without too much difficulty that the same would have been true of poems about the sacks of Thebes and Oikalia. Moreover, the very stylization of these scenes in the Iliad makes them akin to the formulaic systems which give the poem its most characteristic identifier. That is, if formulae show us that a lot of bards before Homer sang about Greek heroes, then the typicality of the battle scenes show us the same thing, that they were the product of many generations of singers rather than the work of a single voice in what was otherwise an archaic soundscape of pleasantness. This is a defining aspect of early Greek culture. And in fact, the Greeks of Homer's day were unusual among their neighbours in how much they enjoyed poeticized violence. The study of early Greece has been hugely changed in the last 40 years, as scholars have documented the ways in which the Greeks were influenced by the contiguous civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean and Mesopotamia. Heracles is now apparently a Greek reflex of the Phoenician deity Melkart or the Mesopotamian god Ninurta, Achadeus is the Sumero-Babylonian king Gilgamesh, and his friend Patroclus is now Gilgamesh's companion Enkidu, and so on. I should say I don't believe any of that, but anyway, that's what scholars say. But one thing for which there is absolutely no parallel in the several Near Eastern civilizations with which the Greeks were in contact is the kind of narrativized violence of which I've been speaking. Sumerians, Hittites, Babylonians, Hurrians, Akkadians, even the Assyrians, who are famous amongst scholars of the ancient Near East for their almost Roman levels of violence, none of them have a poetic tradition like this one. Typically, the enemy in these sorts of traditions is thrown down immediately. The gods are universally supportive of the victorious side. The enemy is faceless, largely nameless. The victory almost never in doubt. Even the ancient Hebrew tradition, with its strong military story about the conquest of Israel, shows nothing like the detailed and sustained, drawn-out narrative focus on violence and its details that we find in Homer. In fact, to move back to the modern world, it has long struck me that one of the best analogues for Homer's combat scenes is to be found in computer games. First-person shooters dominate the industry. They are worth billions of dollars to the world economy, and they thrive on the same POV immediacy, adrenaline rush, and variety of combat experience on which Homer lavished so much attention and effort. They all deploy extensive storylines as well, from historical battles to invented conflicts, to deepen the player's connection with the character's experience. And they are immensely popular. If the Call of Duty franchise can estimate its players in the tens of millions every single month, and the Pentagon, to go back to the start of this talk, to this gentleman here, finally, good, can release video packages with real-world footage of airstrikes on Iran, spliced with gameplay from Call of Duty, then the need for us to confront and to understand the enduring appeal of violence is greater than ever. Let me end on a personal note. I am currently working on a book on the role of violence in the art and literature of archaic Greece. But I am not doing it, in spite of my haircut, in order to enlist in the manosphere. I don't celebrate this violence, I don't condone it, or find in it some model for the modern world to follow. Frankly, I'm baffled by the usurpation of classical culture by some of those who stand on what is termed the alt-right of politics, including Peter Hegseth himself, who has co-authored a book on the need to return to classical values in American and more broadly Western education. That, ladies and gentlemen. But if we are to understand violence and its continual scarring presence in human history, and thereby to understand ourselves, then we need to confront those parts of humanity which frighten us the most. In the ancient world, I suggest we can find much to emulate, but also much which should make us shudder. We have to look at all sides of that world honestly and stop pretending that Homer or his audiences would have enjoyed reading The Guardian. If we want to understand him, we're going to have to understand ourselves. Thank you very much. I should also like to stress that I don't have the coordination to play any of these games, so... but look, we've got 7 minutes, I think, until the Q&A starts. I'd be very happy to take any questions which people have. Yes, please.
Would you ever consider that the Iliad would actually be an anti-war poem because of their stress on violence?
Yeah. So this is, I think, a very popular way of reading the poem now. Some of those cases that I gave you where people shudder at the violence and they don't think of it as being a central part of this world. I don't think that, but I know that a lot of scholars do. particularly in the United States. And a lot of these scholars are coming from places which are struggling to understand why Donald Trump keeps winning. And so my attitude, and I think probably when I get to the end of this book, I'm still going to say that scenes like those in Book 6 and Book 24 are important, but they're not the whole of the poem. The Iliad is 15,000 verses long, 5,000 verses of that, line by line killing. Now that to me seems to be significant. Homer knew that his audience wanted to hear this, and they didn't want to hear it because it was just like, well, this is something that we've got to get through in order to get to the beautiful human moments. This is a human moment. Thank you for that question. Please.
What do you think the juxtaposition of these moments of chaos that you mentioned, like in Book 6 and Book 24, and the constant reiteration of violence, what effect do you think that would have had on Homer's audience?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and it's one of the questions that I'm going to try to answer in the book, and I'm not sure that I've got an answer yet. I think it really does deepen them tremendously, because they recognize that there's a very brief moment between all of the killing, between all of the competitiveness, for a moment for human beings to show something other than that drive. But even in that scene in Book 6, Hector's prayer is not, may this war end so that I may be safe. His prayer is that his son may grow up to be like him, bring the bloody spoil of his foe back to his city so that his mother's heart would be gladdened. Everybody is implicated in this violence. Yeah? But that's a really good question, and I don't know what answer I'm going to get yet. Thank you. Perhaps from the side of the room. Yep.
So some people have considered that Virgil's Aeneid is almost a reaction in some ways to the Iliad, particularly in the way that the Iliad kind of follows out the world of gods and heroes. With looking at the Iliad in the way you've just described as a almost not necessarily pro-violence, but exploring that side of humanity more, how have you thought at all about what that would mean for the Aeneid at all?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things I was trying to bring out when I was talking about the contest of Homer and Hesiod, one of the great things about Virgil was that he was extraordinarily learned in the para-literature surrounding Homer. So he didn't just know his Homer really well. He also knew what every previous scholar had said on Homer. He used the Homeric scholia. He was extraordinarily learned. I think for him, Homer was a great poet of violence. So when you think, but he is also not just bringing Homer into Latin verse, he's also bringing in the epic cycle. So when you think of a figure like Camilla, you're thinking of someone like Penthesilea from the I, Theopas. I believe that we don't often look at the elements of violence in Virgil because the readings are kind of polarized. Yep. So either we have a pro-Augustan reading of this poem, in which all of the violence is rendered necessary, the end's going to justify the means because we finally have peace after the craziness of the rest of the first century BC in Rome. But you also have the Harvard School, people like Michael Putnam, who've written very eloquently over the way that Virgil gives voices to the oppressed and to the dispossessed. And scholarship has been stuck and wavering between these two sorts of poles. And I think that the violence doesn't really serve either pole well. So that is one area that I am going to have to think about quite a bit. Thank you. I think I saw you first. Sorry.
Do you think the sort of divided interpretation of the Iliad, I have to agree with you what the sort of violence was. Do you think it's sort of symptomatic of how the increasingly polarized political sphere are unable to understand each other's viewpoints?
That's a really good question, and I thought something like it would actually come up. Yeah. I wonder whether we have a false view of how polarized political views have been in the past. We always tend to think that the things that are happening now have never happened before, or if they have happened before, they weren't as important. I would put it down to rather, not necessarily because people don't want to understand other people's point of view, but the process by which classical literature has been received and canonized, particularly in Western European, if I can use that term here, literature and culture, renders it much less earthy. Athenian drama was popular art. It was aimed at people of all levels. But the people who go watch Athenian drama now are either university students or very wealthy people living in London. If you think about the analogy of opera, much 19th century Italian opera is popular trash, right? And it was written for a mass audience. But now, it's a marker of the cultural elite, the people who get to pay those horrendous prices at Covent Garden. Yeah? I think that's got more to do with it here. We want to think of these authors as being in some way as refined and cultured and sophisticated as we are. And those bits of the text where they are not, we don't really know what to do with them. And I think in Homer's case, we should start trying to work it out. Thank you, though. Thank you. You were next, yes.
I feel like your conclusion is also valid if you expand from just the Iliad to focus on the Odysseys. The apex of the Odyssey is arguably when Odysseus effectively carries out a purge of his household and
Yep.
people who destroy them. Now, I feel like from an ancient perspective, that would have been a moment that we look back on it as especially brutal, especially the hanging of maids. I feel like for the ancient audience, that could also been interpreted as something very positive. Look back on that and done his duty.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly could have brought the Odyssey more into this, but I only had 30 minutes. I think you are right. A lot of my colleagues, particularly in the States, want to look at what happens in Book 22 of the Odyssey, and particularly what happens to the maids, and think Homer's showing us that this is cruel. No, he's not. He's just showing us that this is what happens. And it is cruel. We should look. That realization is important, right? Because it should strike all of us as cruel. Our values are different. We shouldn't do what Peter and his friends say. We should go back to the ancient world and teach people by reading Plato from a young age. What a terrible, terrible thing. But the point here is that Homer, there's no good evidence in the text that Homer was at all queasy about what happens to them. There's no good evidence that he thought that the killing of the suitors wasn't necessary given what the suitors had done. It has ramifications. The suitors' families suit up and boot up for another fight in Book 24. But it's necessary. In this world, it's just necessary. Thank you, though. Yes? I do, actually. So I often feel that in the interpretation of classical literature, or at least the interpretation of those elements which have got to do with war and violence and fighting, that modern English literature, particularly the First World War poets, really shifted the way in which we evaluate this kind of literature. But look at it like this. How many of us sitting in this room have ever fought in a battle? Numbers would be small. How many of us have even been in a fight? The numbers, again, are going to be small. For Homer and his audiences, almost every member of that audience had either fought in a battle, knew a family member, or had lost a family member who had fought in a battle, routinely went out in order to defend their land and their rights. Physical violence is an ordinary part of this world. It's not an ordinary part of ours, and we don't relate to it. We find it very difficult to get back into their heads here. And that's probably a good thing. But it means that if we want to read this text, if we want to understand this text, and then if we want to see why is it that people like this bloke, who talk in such an almost exaggerated, hyper-masculine way, why it is that it has such appeal, there is something in the human being, and we've just got to recognise it. The Red Hot Chili Peppers, my favourite band when I was a young man, talked about the killing fist of the human beast. And if we're going to get into the mind of Homer and his audiences, we have to bring it back. Thank you. And I'm being told that we have run out of time. That's it. Thank you all very much. Sorry. Can I take? Yeah. I should take that off. Right.
Okay, welcome back. I'm Ben Gray. I've just started in Cambridge as a lecturer in ancient history and Greek history. I hope you've had a good day. I thought it was a very interesting afternoon of lectures and gave you a good sense of the different approaches and different styles in the two places. Now's the chance to ask our student helpers from both Oxford and Cambridge some questions. If parents and teachers, if there's anyone here, if you'd like to stay, that's fine, but you also have your own session on supporting applicants, which is in G19 in the Classics Faculty building, so you might prefer to go to that. If you can use this time, if you haven't already, to fill in the feedback form on the day, that would be very helpful for planning for the future. So we'll move into questions in a minute. First, maybe the four students could just briefly introduce themselves and what they're studying and their college. And check the microphone.
Do you want to start? Or? Hello. No. Hello. Hello. Is anyone feeling like they might? Ooh. Hello.
Hello. Oh, mine works.
Pass it along.
Yeah. There it is. Hi, I'm Karina. I'm studying classical archaeology and ancient history at St John's College, Oxford, and I'm in my second year.
Hello. Hello. I'm Eleanor. I'm a third year classics with biblical and rabbinic Hebrew at St John's College in Oxford.
Hello, I'm Sophia. I'm a second year on the 4-year course at Cambridge, and I'm studying at King's.
Hi. Do I need to press the button? No.
I think so.
Hi, I'm Naomi. I'm in my third year of the three... I'm Naomi, and I'm in my third year of the 3-year course at Christ's, Cambridge.
Thanks very much. Okay, so let's open out to just ask any questions that you'd like, anything you'd like to know about what it's like to study in both places. Go ahead, I'll wait for the microphone. We've got 2 microphones coming around.
Hi, so with the classics and biblical Hebrew, are you learning the Greek and Hebrew both from scratch?
Yeah, so I, in my first year, did Greek from scratch, and then now in my third year, I'm starting both biblical and rabbinic from scratch. Yeah.
Other questions? Oh, here we go.
What does the archaeological aspect of ancient history and archaeology entail? Like, what sorts of things do you study?
So in first year, you do 2 papers, which are core papers that everyone... Is that on? Yes. Yeah. So you do 2 papers that everyone does. So you do an ancient Greek paper and you do a Roman paper, but then you can choose any archaeology paper you want to. There are about 4 or 5 to choose from, I think. I did Homeric archaeology, so looking at Bronze Age, sort of Crete and Minoan and Mycenaean cultures. And then in second year, you get, for second and third year, you get a much wider choice to choose from. And also at the end of your first year summer, you get a grant from the faculty to go and do some archaeological field work. So I went to Vagina in northern Greece for 3 weeks, all funded by the faculty, and that's an automatic grant that every first year CAR student gets. You don't have to apply for it, you just get it.
This is for anyone, but like, what do you think made your application stand out?
I mean, I can go for it if you'd like. I think for me, finding a niche, so that's maybe something you've been told by teachers, it's what I was told, of kind of something outside of the curriculum that I was really passionate about, that I did lots of reading on. So for me it was ancient poetry, so I read all of the poetry, different translations of it, like Anne Carson's translation of Sappho and stuff like that, and then I watched some lectures on it. I read some secondary scholarship, and then it was just something that I was passionate about, enjoyed talking about, and was able to talk about in an interview. So finding something that you can talk about confidently and you have lots of opinions on.
You want a second answer? I mean, I would second that as very much about showing your own interests. And one way that I found was quite useful to do that was there are quite a lot of different essay competitions open to sixth form students, some run by specific universities or colleges, and that's quite a good way of being forced to focus for about 2,000 words and really get into a subject. And you don't have to win them, but it's still a useful sort of guided way of thinking.
Can I also ask, for the Cambridge students, what was your interview like?
Yeah, interviewed more recently.
Obviously, Cambridge and Oxford both look to improve their interview process every year, and so when you guys are going into interview, it might be a bit different. But I had 2 interviews, and basically across the 2 interviews, it'll be a mixture of sort of looking at stuff that you've talked about on your personal statement. You'll look at some unseen stuff, so that might be unseen literature. It might be that you're looking at an image, so it could be a sculpture or some pottery. So they just want to really see how you think, and both what you're interested in, but also seeing how you approach unseen material and seeing how you can be challenged. And so it's trying to be like it's trying to see how you fit the sort of supervision style of teaching and whether you can sort of enter that dialogue. And so know your personal statement really well and know what you've been studying in your A-levels well if you do a classical subject, but also just be prepared to be challenged by something that you haven't seen before. It's quite good practice to just like try speaking out loud and sort of talking to yourself and going through answers like that if you can't get sort of interview prep. But just thinking about it, interview is sort of a scary word, but it's more like a dialogue with and seeing that supervision style of teaching.
Thank you.
So speaking of like niches and stuff, this is kind of more for the Oxford students. Would you say that it's more important that, you know, if we have to spend, you know, an hour in uni prep, that we spend time further exploring whatever niche we're specifically interested in, or trying to spend more time kind of leveling out our interests? Like if you're super duper interested in ancient Greek poetry, spend more time on Latin history to even it out a little bit, or that to stick with the niche?
I think it's hard because I'm very stubborn, so I will not do anything I don't want to do. And so if I didn't want to do Roman history, I wasn't going to do it. I think, to be honest, the course at Oxford, our like the way that it's set up means that you can very much choose what you're interested in. So I would kind of always advocate to explore areas that you're interested in. And if that means that you have to kind of find a different way into history or a different way, like if you're very much a Latinist, like how can you, you know, if you want to branch more into becoming a bit of a Hellenist, you know, maybe start with Imperial Greek stuff and work backwards. Maybe that's kind of an easier approach. I think, especially my experience with interviews was that if there was something that it was clear that I had a lot to talk about, time was obviously given to allowing me that space. And you're not expected to know everything. In a subject like classics, it's impossible to know everything. We do so much day to day. So, yeah, I mean, that's just my opinion on the matter. But yeah, I would always prioritise something you enjoy, at least if it's extracurricular. Like, as the Cambridge students were saying before, make sure you have kind of a base level, know what you need to know for your A levels or equivalent really well, but anything extra, you might as well prioritise something that brings you joy, I guess. But, yeah.
What have you found challenging studying classics at Oxbridge or Cambridge?
Should we go down the line and say,
I found the tutorial structure and I guess supervisions at Cambridge something that took a bit of getting used to, just because it's quite a small discussion that you have, and so you do the reading, you write the essay, you hand the essay in, and then you go, and especially in my first year, because I'm the only one in my year doing CAR and my college, so most of my tutorials were one-to-one, and I wasn't used to having that kind of just an hour to chat with an adult about something I was interested in and something I'd read about. So I think that took a bit of getting used to, but it's a really amazing opportunity to have that kind of small group teaching. It's brilliant. It just takes a bit of getting used to.
For me, I found time management quite hard, like especially for the Oxford joint degrees. Like it can be very difficult to manage your work, especially if you're between two different faculties and they don't know the ins and outs of the other faculties. They don't know when you might have loads on the classic side, for example. I think for me that was a challenge, but I think things like language teaching, where it's very structured and you've got kind of the work to do, and then you turn up for the hour, you've got your list of 10 words that you needed for that lesson or whatever. For me, those sorts of contact hours were really helpful, and I noticed that compared to like my friends who do like history or something, where they have much fewer contact hours, I was learning to manage my time a lot better and more quickly than they were. So pros and cons to everything, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah, I would also say even though classics does have more contact hours than other humanities, and it's such a great thing because you do get to spend time with these amazing academics, the jump from A-level to university is mainly in how you have to learn to sort of self-motivate, because your days are a lot less structured than they were when you're in school. And so you have to learn how to manage your time like that, as you were saying. But I think what I also found is, like, ironically, just keep yourself busy. I feel like the busier that I am, the easier it is to just keep that momentum going. So I always feel like if I have one thing to do, then I'll procrastinate it. But if I have a whole to-do list, then I'll get that done. But that might not work for you. Just find out what keeps you going and what motivates you, because at the end of the day, you have to motivate yourself when you're at university.
So yeah, I would say very similar things to everyone else. So I think one of the things I most struggled with was gauging the correct amount of time to spend on a task. So it's very easy to say, like, oh, I'm going to spend the afternoon doing like flashcards, which I really enjoy, and I'm not going to think about doing the reading for this essay, or even I'm going to spend this afternoon sort of chatting to my friends. And I think learning how to go into the library and spend a day reading and write the essay a few days in advance rather than leaving it till the night before, which you can get away with in school, but then it becomes sort of, you can't do that with a 10,000 word dissertation. So like planning time like that.
First here.
I was just wondering, are any of you thinking about doing a dissertation, and if so, what is it on?
I am currently writing my third year dissertation, and this is 10,000 words. And at Cambridge it can be on anything as long as it's classical. Mine is on exchange relationships in Plautus. So Plautus is a Roman comedy playwright, and I'm looking at 3 of his plays and the sort of transactional undertones that sort of exist in the relationships between lots of characters and what that might mean for sort of how comedy works and how Roman society works.
Thank you.
For classical archaeology and ancient history, you have to do a 10,000-word sort of project dissertation between your second and third year. So we've just finished Hilary term now, and before the end of Easter, have to send in my question, but because it's more archaeology based, it'll either be an object or a sort of site or a group of objects from the same site or something like that. But I found an object in the British Museum that I found really interesting, and then you kind of pick an ancient history theme or question related to that object.
What was your object?
It's a random little perfume vessel in the British Museum that's in the shape of a woman dancing, and I'm going to connect it to kind of comedies and depictions of hetairai.
Thank you.
One thing to note about the Oxford Classics course is that a dissertation is not compulsory. You can choose to do a dissertation, and you can choose to do it in two ways. You can replace one of your 8 finals papers with a dissertation or a thesis, as it's called, or you can do what I'm doing, which is to offer an additional 9th paper as a thesis. So I'm hoping to write about Nicandrian toxicology, which if anybody's interested in like spider bites and snakes, maybe go read some Nicander. It's a bit gruesome, but it's quite fun. It's not something that's compulsory as part of the course. So if that's something you really want to do, there's the opportunity for you to do it in 2 different ways. But also if it's something that you don't want to do, you don't have to. So I guess that's worth bearing in mind.
That's the same at Cambridge. So in your final year, you have to take 4 papers, and these could be all exam, or you could swap one for a dissertation.
Thank you.
This is less specifically classics related, but how is kind of working in colleges and then also with the faculty, like where do you enjoy like the balance of that?
Go down the line again.
I think it's really nice to have both the college and the faculty. So the faculty is great, particularly for getting books from the library and meeting other people that are doing the same or very similar things to you. And the college is really good for, again, having this like space with libraries, with food, with accommodation, and also with people who are doing very, very different things to you. So you're not siloed into, oh, I'm only talking to other Latinists. You're also talking to people from other subjects.
And it's a really nice balance because usually there'll be sort of classes, like language classes and lectures in the faculty, and then you'll have supervisions in your college, or it might be that like you might get supervisors from other colleges, but but college teaching is usually on that smaller scale, and so you build that sort of pedagogical relationship. And also not just in classics, but in quite a lot of the colleges, the sort of bond that you have with between the year groups with people in your cohort is really nice. I know some subjects at some colleges have subject dinners where everyone in all the year groups and all the fellows who do that subject will have a nice dinner together. At King's, we have the King's Classical Society where one of the fellows will invite a speaker in, and then we'll all gather and we'll all listen to them speak, and then we'll all have a nice discussion with them afterwards. And so outside of just the contact hours that you're mandated to have, like, you really sort of develop a love of learning in that sense, and so it's just a really nice all-round experience.
For at least my experience of classics at Oxford, we tend to have a system of the mornings being faculty teaching and then the afternoons being like college teaching. So all of my lectures, language classes, all happen in the morning, which I'm not sure Greek ab initio at 9 a.m. was my favourite class of the year. But that is a good way of kind of dividing it physically. So you have, there's never clashes or difficulties with that, and it works very, very smoothly. And I think, to echo what the two Cambridge students have said about the fact that you meet obviously lots of classicists in the faculty, that if you're in a college where there's only 3 classicists or less in a year group, that's the place to meet classicists, is the faculty. So that's a really good opportunity. But then college teaching, whether it's 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 or even 3-to-1, you have that kind of specific tutorial teaching relationship with your tutor that is very different from what a lecture can offer you, for example.
Yeah, sort of to echo that again, but especially with classical archaeology and ancient history, because you have 2 core papers in your first year, those tend to be taught as classes. So we had kind of lectures in the faculty building, then all of us, we were split into, I think, there's about 30 of us in the year, so we were split into sort of 3 classes. I had a class in Oriel College, which isn't my college, but I'd go there with a group of people and we'd have our class there. And then also we had tutorials, and I've had tutorials at Lady Margaret Hall, and I've had tutorials at Corpus Christi, even though I'm at St John's. So it's quite nice that you get to meet new people, explore new colleges, meet other tutors, and then you have the main faculty building. And then, similar to, it sounds like King's College, Cambridge do, at St John's we have the Donald Russell Society, which is our college-wide classic society. So I'm doing CAR, but I also get to meet people doing Cambs, people doing straight classics, and we have guest lecturers and dinners and stuff like that. So there is definitely a nice mix of faculty, classes, tutorials, college. It all kind of blends nicely together.
Sorry, back
just the next one back. First, this one.
Just to jump back to the dissertations for a second. When you say specifically for Oxford that you can either switch one of your papers out or do it as an additional, if you did it as an additional, how would that change either like grades or stuff like that?
So essentially your grade for your finals will be based on your top 8 papers. So if you've submitted a thesis as a 9th paper, if the thesis is a higher mark than your lowest examined paper, providing that the rest of your papers still fit into the required rules for like how many you need to be text-based, how many need to be, archaeology or whatever, it means that you can, your thesis replaces the grade of your lowest exam. So it's kind of a backup option, but equally you have to do all the work to make it into a backup option. So yeah, it offers flexibility, but it's what would be called a special thesis. If you want to look more on I would recommend looking in the handbook for how it works exactly. But it means that you essentially have free rein to produce something based, obviously it has to be classical as with the Cambridge rules, but yeah.
And then here.
This is a bit of a specific question for the Oxford people, but what was it about your college that made you really like it and choose it?
I mean, we're both the same college, so maybe we're a bit biased. For me, in genuine honesty, it was that I noticed that my college was involved in a lot of access events like this, which for me gave me the opportunity to see the tutors talk, give a lecture, and I felt like I wanted to be a part of a college that wanted me and wanted to kind of get in touch with me, and tutors who gave up their time to do an event like this. So yeah, I know it's a bit of a maybe it's a bit of a cringe answer considering we're all here today, but yeah, I would say that because, as Karina said, I've been taught at so many colleges across the 3 years of my degree so far that academically there's not that much difference, and you will be taught by whoever's in the position to teach you, regardless of if they hold a position at your college or not. So I would just have a look on the website, or if you get a chance to visit, get a chance to visit. And, you know, if you like the buildings, or if something like accommodation is important, or a gym, or an orchestra, or all of these kind of things, it's just completely up to you what you want personally, but yeah.
Kind of seconding that, I took choosing my college a bit too seriously and made a spreadsheet of every single Oxford college. My first column was then, does it teach the course that I want? Because almost all of them do, but there are a couple that don't offer CAR just because it's a smaller course. So then I discounted all of those ones, obviously, and then it was just things like, what societies did it have? Was it catered? Did it guarantee accommodation all 3 years? Because some of them guarantee accommodation if you're on a 4-year course for 3 of your 4 years. So just, yeah, for me, also the location of it, it's right opposite the classics faculty. But I'd recommend thinking about what you want from it. So if you're big on rowing, certain colleges have really great boat clubs with loads of budgets. If you're big on acting, Keble has a theatre. If you're big on music, look at the music societies or the choir. Find out what you want from your college, because, as already said, the teaching will be there. So college is more about like your life at the university. And then, yeah, I made a spreadsheet. I chose my like top 5 on the spreadsheet, and then I went to visit them and I had a look around. And John's, the location of it, the gardens, the fact that it's kind of in town but also has big gardens was really good for me. It felt right. So yeah, kind of think about what you want from a college and then go and visit them, and don't overthink it too much.
Do you want to add anything on Cambridge College?
I mean, I chose Christ's because I had seen Carrie Vout, who's our Director of Studies, at this very open day. And I thought she seemed really nice, and she sort of spoke about really interesting things. There was also a level of UCAS was due and I needed to put somewhere down. And so I'd been for a quick walk around, but I hadn't really looked at anything until after I applied. And I think I was quite lucky in that we've got really nice central location with like beautiful gardens inside, guaranteed accommodation all 3 years with at least first year on site, and then the opportunity to live in a house or continue living on main site. Free laundry, which is pretty big, and close to lectures, close to the boathouse, and we've got a really nice classic society. So again, there's lots of good things, and no matter where you end up, you'll discover these sort of things that you wouldn't have thought of originally, but then become really important.
Yeah, I'd say my choice was kind of a combination of what people have already said, like with the fellows. Like, I don't know if anyone's seen Simon Goldhill's Massa lectures, but the first time that I saw him in college, it was like meeting a celebrity. Yeah, King's had a very nice central location. I have to be honest, I kind of wanted to be at the college that everybody recognises with the big chapel. But a really good location, really good accommodation, and also I knew that they had a reputation for outreach as well, and they have a very high proportion of state-educated students, and so I felt very comfortable applying to a college that was so passionate about access and outreach and providing those opportunities to students like me.
Maybe more a question about university in general, but how do you find managing costs? Like, is there even time for a job with how universities like this are? And if it's the case where there isn't time for a job, how do you manage things like that?
So some colleges will actually not allow you to work during term time, just because it would be unmanageable to expect students to do that. At John's, for example, there are lots of opportunities to work in the access team, which are paid opportunities, which students can take a lot of benefit from. Oxford is a very expensive city. However, like a college with heavily subsidised food and accommodation is like, a great place to live in that, be able to live in that city whilst it's you know, still quite an expensive environment. There are an awful lot of grants available, so things like travel grants for, like you can go visit Greece or Rome as long as you put a museum on the itinerary. You can more or less get the faculty to pay for it. So if you're savvy about things like that and you make sure that you are aware of the opportunities that are available, I don't think it's unmanageable. I know a lot of people who work in the VAC. I've also had jobs in the VAC before, and that, you know, is a standard part of being a student in this economy, I guess. But it's, you know, that if you apply to a college that has, you know, enough financial kind of ability, I guess, to support you, they're going to support you and make sure that you're in the best place to do your studies as possible. So in a place like Oxbridge, and as much Cambridge as it is for Oxford, like, you are going to be looked after perhaps more than other universities, just because of the facilities that, you know, the subject has and things like that. So if it's something that's worrying you about going to university in general, I wouldn't be put off applying to Oxbridge because of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would say similar to Oxford, you're kind of not really allowed to work. However, there are opportunities like working at open days. Some colleges have bars that are run by students, and so that also provides the opportunity for sort of regular work as well. There's also the Cambridge bursary, which is if your household income is beneath a certain amount, then when you apply for student finance, you will automatically also be given a bursary at the same time that you get your student finance payments, which can just help with the cost of living, as well as, yeah, you don't have to pay it back at all as well, which is, it's incredibly helpful. And also the fact that the terms are shorter also means that you're generally spending less money as you're away from home for a shorter amount of time. The accommodation contracts are shorter, so unlike at other universities where you're paying for your accommodation when you're not necessarily staying there, when you leave your accommodation, you can, at Cambridge, at King's at least, I don't want to speak on other colleges, but you can choose between a long or a short contract. So if you choose a short contract, you only have to pay for the weeks of your accommodation during term time. So you're actually not paying for accommodation while you're not there, which also means that it actually does cost a lot less in the long term. And so I think the financial support at Oxbridge is incredibly good. We're incredibly privileged and lucky to be at places that can support us like this. And these universities work very hard to make sure that finances are never a barrier to you accessing university.
Also, can I just add, it's also not just literally like your cost of living, so your food and your accommodation and stuff, but there are also really good schemes for social events where lots of events, and I'm sure people have heard of like the big college balls that happen, tend to always have access tickets and stuff like that. At Oxford, we also have a similar bursary scheme. There's the Crankstart Scholarship and the Oxford Bursary. And then if you're in receipt of one of those, that can make you eligible for access tickets. So not only will you have subsidised cost of living, but you'll also be able to partake in all of these big events that are an important and fun part of being at these universities.
Thank you.
Oh, there's another question here. And then
for the people doing the 4-year courses, do you recommend like familiarizing yourself with like Latin before your first year, or just like going in blank slate?
When I was at sixth form, my sixth form teacher ran a Latin club because my school didn't offer Latin, but she wanted to help students that might be applying for classics. And whilst that did kind of help, when I then came to Cambridge in my first year, we learnt Latin completely differently to how it was taught. And so I would say you don't need to familiarise yourself. For the 4-year course, you do 2 weeks at the beginning of September before you arrive properly in October to fully familiarise yourself with the very basics of the language. and it's very thorough. It's quite intense. It's, I think, 6 hours of teaching a day, but it does mean that not only do you get to know everyone else in your cohort, you get to be familiar with the city before everyone else comes in, and then Freshers Week is a lot less of a stressful experience because of it. But it's also really helpful with coming to grips with the language, and you will not struggle at all if you don't familiarize yourself with Latin. It sometimes might hurt if you try learning Latin one way and then you come in and then they're teaching it in a completely different way. And so whilst the first couple of weeks will be intense, the language teaching here is of very, very high quality, and you will, so long as you apply yourself, you won't struggle. It will be completely fine.
From an Oxford point of view, we've recently had reforms regarding our classics mods, which are the exams you sit halfway through your course, which means that we're going to have a larger number of streams for each language. So regardless of what ability you come to university with, whether that's like you've done the A-level or you've done a GCSE or you've done a bit of self-study or whatever, or you've got absolutely nothing, that there will be an appropriate level for you coming into the course. So there's not an expectation that you will kind of, suddenly, know Greek in the summer holiday. That's not, or Latin or whichever language you choose. That's not the expectation. But there is always room to accommodate you if you have had time to do things like that, etc.
Considering essay writing is so integral to, well, I suppose any degree, how did you navigate, or what kind of guidance did you receive to write academic essays from, let's say, a post-16 level, so A-level or equivalent, to a university level?
I mean, I'll jump on it again, essay competitions. Just of a sort of having any kind of practice of writing something that's about 2,000 words can be useful. So whether that's a sort of piece of coursework in school or an extended essay or EPQ or a competition or something you choose to write in your own time, you do have to learn by trial and error to some extent. In my first essay that I wrote at Cambridge, the supervisor did send out a document that basically explained how to format a bibliography. But beyond that, it's unhelpful, but there's never really any one way of doing it, and it can be quite hard to sort of from scratch do it, and then suddenly 3 years have passed, and somehow in that time you've learned how to write an essay. So it's a step up, but the sort of basics of essay writing that you may already have done at GCSE or in essay-based subjects at sixth form will still sort of come through.
I'm going to emphasize there trial and error. So one of my first essays that I handed in was supposed to be 2,000 words, and I got to 1,300 and got stuck, and I think I handed it in and it was 1,340 words, because I just didn't really know what else to add to it or what else to say. So yeah, trial and error really. You learn while you're doing it, and different tutors will have different things they want you to do. So I had one tutor who would say that she wouldn't mark it unless you've named the file HA for Homeric archaeology, the number that, like, if it was week 4, you had to put 4, and then you had to put a quick title, and then you had to put dash and your initials. And she was like, yep, this is how I want the essays to be, this is how I want the file name, and that's what you're going to do. And then you also had to, like, footnotes had to be a certain way, numbers on the page had to be a certain way, you had to have your name on, like, the top header bit. I've had another tutor who's gone, I don't really care if you have a bibliography in there, like, as long as your essay is there, it's fine. So it really does depend on your tutor, what they want from you, but they will make it clear what they want from you. And especially at the beginning, as long as you get a piece of work in, they can help you through it. So if you hand something in, they can sit down when they give you your feedback and say, this was good, this was less good, this is how to improve it, and they help you through it.
Just emphasize it as well at Cambridge. None of the essays that you're writing for supervision go towards your grade in any way. So you can, not submit an essay, you can write an absolutely awful essay, and it's still sort of part of the learning process, and it won't mean that 3 years on you're failing your degree because of it.
Yeah, you will get very specific guidance for coursework essays, and so the essays where it really matters how you're formatting things, you will be given very specific guidance, but it can really vary from person to person. I was quite lucky that I did an EPQ when I was in sixth form, and so I feel like I developed my skills in that way, but if you're not doing an EPQ again, essay competitions are one of the best ways to do that. Or just sort of learning by looking, like if you have friends that are doing EPQs, like ask them how they format that, or if you can find sort of articles on JSTOR and things like that to just, when you're doing reading for an essay, then you can sort of learn kind of by assimilation in that way. But yeah, sometimes you just have to get it wrong before you get it right.
There's another question on this side.
Is it usual to be kind of like paired with a specialist in tutorials, or should you kind of take into consideration what each college's tutors' specialisms are when applying?
Sorry, should I start? Yeah. So please, don't Google your tutor. Read everything they've ever written and parrot it back to them in the interview, because they will not like it and it will not go well for you. That's my first caveat. I think, yeah, if, for example, my college is quite Hellenist heavy at the minute, so when I was looking to do my Latin didactic paper, none of the tutors were particularly interested in teaching that to me, so I was, they emailed their contacts, etc., and you get paired with the specialist. So it is there is never a situation where a tutor will be teaching you, an essay paper that they are not qualified to teach you. So as much as, check out your tutors, listen to them, etc. If you're interested in having conversations with them, you'd like to meet them, etc., that can be obviously an important consideration in choosing your college. But, if you're really obsessed with Llewellyn Morgan, maybe don't just apply to Brasenose because of him, because he might go on sabbatical or something like this. Do you know what I mean? But anyway, having said that, I think we might need to go so the bus doesn't go without us and we can actually make it back to Oxford in time to continue our degrees. But thank you for having us. Thank you, Cambridge, for having us. Okay.
Oh, right, I thought we had to do a 4 o'clock break. Thanks for doing it. Are there any final questions for our Cambridge helpers?
And we could, just to add on to that last question, at Cambridge, in your first couple of years, so 1A, for example, which is the second year of the 4-year course, first year of the 3-year course, you have to do Greek literature and Latin literature and try out ancient history, philosophy, linguistics, and art and archaeology. And I don't think there's a single college where you have people that are specialised in all 6, so you will be moving around. And it is convenient if you have someone at your college that teaches a lot of papers that you do, so that you have less of a commute. But it's really sort of, in no world will you sort of not have to go to other specialists for something.
And also sometimes you will be taught by PhD students as well, and they will also have specialisms. In my prelim year, which was the first year of the 4-year course, I had a PhD student who was supervising me for my coursework on Latin literature, and that was especially helpful because they had been an undergrad a lot more recently, and so they understood what it meant to write an undergraduate piece of coursework as well, and so there's also sort of specialism in that sense too.
Has anyone got a last question? Oh, go ahead.
What A-levels did you guys do?
I did Latin and Greek A-levels, as well as French, and then I did history for a year and a half, and I'd actually sort of decided to drop it after I'd got my Cambridge offer, which was quite a back and forth with the college of sort of saying, please, will you let me drop it and keep my offer? And them saying, we really would prefer if you didn't. But it's also, there's not many people who have had the opportunity even to do one or both of the ancient languages. And this was very much coming from a sort of specific school in a university town that happened to offer it.
I did English literature, psychology, classical civilization, and drama, as well as an EPQ, but my offer did not include my grade in drama, so it was A star, AA, but they didn't really care what I got in drama because it wasn't really as academic a subject as the other one. But that doesn't mean that just because a subject isn't academic, you shouldn't do it, because I know people who have done 3 A-levels, one of which being drama, and they have still have gotten offers. And so your offer might be, they might ask for an A-star in a specific subject, for example. It really just depends on the college.
I mean, I did maths and further maths with Latin and Greek, and I really was very close to doing a maths degree. So there's really no right A-levels is the answer.
There's time if someone's got another quick question, or we've covered a lot of ground.
I feel like this is a common question that you've probably been asked in the past, but how did you generally find the transition from sixth form or equivalent to university?
In some ways it was like as hard as I expected, and there's a lot of sort of, you have to keep track of every aspect of your life, so you sort of need to know every day, not just what you're doing academically, but also sort of how to get to your lectures, and sort of what are you going to eat for lunch, and sort of do you have any clean clothes, which I felt, you know, I knew how to use a washing machine when I came to university. Some people in my sort of building didn't know that, and so it's worth thinking like around now, like, do you feel competent in many aspects of life? But then, and obviously the academic work was more difficult, but overall I would say it was surprisingly easy to settle in, like maybe because Cambridge and Oxford both have quite short and intense terms, but after 2 or 3 weeks you feel like you've been there for years, and it's still new, but it's sort of, it's not as terrifying as it seems from a sort of year 12, year 13 perspective.
Yeah, I found with the 4-year course, it was quite easy to settle in because there was, as I was talking about, the 2-week course at the beginning of September where you sort of have that intense Latin teaching, so you get to know everyone on your course first, and you get to stay in the same accommodation with them for 2 weeks. And so by the time that I actually came at the beginning of the academic year, I did know everyone in my cohort, and so I had one less thing to worry about. I knew the people who were teaching me, I knew where all my lectures would be, and life at Cambridge is quite cushy. We have bedders, which are housekeeping staff who clean your room every week. If you can cook, but you can also go to your colleges. We call it the servery at King's, but different colleges have different names. Pembroke call it trough, which is kind of weird, but yeah, so you can get catered food at college, and so sometimes our lives are a bit easier than other university students. You don't have to worry about finding second-year housing. You just have college accommodation, and so that is the jump that you expect for there to be, and you will have to go through some challenges, but like you will come out of it more experienced, and life at Cambridge is quite easy, not easy, but that it's designed to be as frictionless as possible, I'd say.
I think it's like particularly it's like a very old-fashioned system of sort of, I don't know, you're a medieval or you're a Victorian gentleman and you come to university, but there's still an expectation of your primary focus is your academic learning and your degree, and so a lot of the then like social living aspects are made seamless. And there's also sort of lots of opportunities to try extracurricular activities, perhaps sort of the same as every university, but there's lots of special things like rowing, and so there's lots of ways to make friends, and that's quite nice.
Another quick question.
With essay competitions, do you think it matters whether it's run by Cambridge or not?
No, or I don't think in any meaningful way that they're keeping track of sort of your name, and then when you apply to that college, they're saying, well, I didn't like what they put in sort of paragraph 5. I think it's useful to look around at, multiple places, just sort of see. I know St. John's, Oxford has quite a big one with lots of different questions about sort of some ancient history, some archaeology, some literature, and possibly others. And it's probably more relevant on your application as to what kind of thing you were writing about than sort of specifically they don't care, like, if you're applying to Cambridge, that you entered an Oxford competition or vice versa. And they're also not going to say, like, oh, because this was really bad, we're not going to let you in sort of now for this other application, or because this was so good, we're going to let you in automatically. Like, it's sort of, they're quite separate things.
And I would also say the most important things about the essay competitions are what you can express that you took away from it. And so I remember when I was applying, I did the St. John's essay competition, and the question was about memory. And then that ended up being a theme that ran through the entirety of my personal statement. And I looked at the concept of memory in all the different texts that I read, and it was sort of that common thread that ran through my personal statement. And so I feel like part of what stood out about my application was I took this one thing and I showed how I thought about it in different ways. So if you can, in your personal statement, if you can write more than just, I did this essay competition, if you can put what kind of thought process maybe you had when you were doing it. Obviously, you have a limited character count, so like they're not expecting you to go through the entirety of your essay, but if you can sort of implement what you took away from it, or like what it made you think about, or sort of tie that in with other super curriculars that you did, that would be what would matter most.
Great. I thought that was a really helpful discussion. So do fill in the feedback form. That would be very helpful. And otherwise, thanks very much to our student helpers from Oxford and especially from Cambridge who are still here.